Hey there and welcome back. If you have settled in for the night, and the room has gone quiet around you, and you are ready to let this day and all its small noise slip away from you, then you are just where you ought to be. Because tonight I am going to carry you a long way back into England, as it was almost 300 years ago, into a single ordinary day lived under the Georgian sky, when the country houses stood among their parks, and the year still turned by the ringing of the church bell across the fields. Tonight is for anyone who has ever wondered what it truly felt like to be alive then, not the famous names and the famous events you find in the histories, but the plain shape of one day, the waking and the dressing, and the working and the eating and the long slow coming of the night. And because no two lives under that sky were ever the same, I am going to show you two of them at once, set quietly side by side, the day of the rich in their golden and well-furnished house, and the day of the poor, in their one small room across the same fields, the same hours falling so very differently upon the two. You need only lie still and let yourself be carried there, out of this century and into that one, to a morning just before first light, when the manor and the cottage both lie sleeping and the day has not yet begun. We will move through that day together, from the cold dark before the dawn to the banked and dying fire of the night. We will stand in the hall when the dinner is carried in, and we will pause a moment in the low doorway of the cottage, where the pot holds nothing half so fine. We will follow the rising and the resting of both houses, the servants on the back stairs and the labourer in the field, the lady at her music and the wife at her spinning. And by the end of it, when both dwellings have gone dark again, you may find that the distance between them and the single sky they shared has stayed quietly with you. Before we step back into that day, I would like to know where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what the hour is where you are. Whether it is late and the night is full, or the grey middle of an afternoon, or one of those small hours when the rest of the house has gone to sleep and the time belongs to you alone, you are welcome here, and I am glad of your company. If you would care to leave a word in the comments, telling me the place you are listening from and the time upon your own clock, I do read them, and I find there is a quiet companionship in knowing how far these calm hours travel. And if this is the kind of evening you would like to find your way back to, you are always welcome to subscribe so that the next of these journeys can come to you when it is ready. There is no hurry in any of it. The past will keep. Picture this. It is the hour before the dawn, and the country lies in that deep blue darkness that comes just before the first grey light, when the birds have not yet begun, and the air is at its coldest, and the land seems to be holding its breath. Set your mind down gently in a green English valley, fields and hedgerows and a slow brown river winding through, a church tower rising among the trees, and on a low rise above it all, ringed by its park and its old spreading trees, the house. It is a fine house, built within the last 100 years in the new and elegant fashion of pale honey-coloured stone, long and handsome and even, its tall windows still unlit, its many chimneys cold for this last hour before the fires are kindled. The lawns before it lie grey with dew. The gravel sweep is empty. The deer move quietly under the trees of the park, and beyond the park wall the land falls away into the ordinary working country, the ploughed fields and the pastures and the dark lines of the hedges. And down there, beyond the wall, where the lane runs between the hedgerows toward the village, there is another dwelling, so much smaller that you might almost miss it in the gloom. A low cottage of clay and timber, with a roof of thatch and a single thread of last night's smoke still rising, thin and grey, from its one squat chimney. The manor and the cottage, a quarter of a mile and a whole world apart, both sleeping, both waiting for the day to come. And the day in both begins not with the master and not with the labourer, but with the first stirring of those who must rise before anyone else, and the kindling of the first fire against the dark. For in the house upon the rise, The first to wake are not the family at all. While the master and the mistress still lie deep in their curtained beds in the best chambers, snug under their blankets with the night not yet over for them, the lowest of the servants are already stirring in the cold attics beneath the roof, where the maids sleep 2 and 3 to a bed under the slope of the rafters. A bell, or the hard habit of years, wakes them in the blackness, and they rise shivering into the cold, for there is no fire up here, and the morning air bites. And they dress quickly in the dark, fumbling with their clothes by feel, and come down the narrow back stairs that the family never use, down into the silent house. The youngest housemaid is often the first of all, a girl of perhaps 15, her hands already roughened by the work, carrying her box of brushes and cloths and her pail. She goes first to the rooms the family will use, and there, kneeling on the cold hearth in the dark, she rakes out the dead grey ashes of last night's fire, carries them away, brushes and blacks the grate, and lays and lights a new fire, so that the room may be warm and bright by the time its owners come down hours from now. Then on to the next room, and the next, the same cold, kneeling work, while the house is still dark and silent, and hers alone. There is something strange and a little eerie in those first dark hours, the great house silent and shadowed all around her, the family sleeping above, the grand room standing empty and cold and waiting, the only light her single candle moving from grate to grate. She knows every corner of these rooms, and yet they are not hers. She tends them and keeps them, and will never sit in them. She moves through the sleeping house like a small busy ghost, making ready a world she does not belong to, so that others may wake to find it warm. And all across the country, in every house like this one, other girls just like her are doing the very same thing, in the very same dark, the great unseen first labour of the day, lighting the fires of England before the sun is up. And the cottage, for all its poverty, was itself a place of work beyond the keeping of the house, for the poor pieced together their living from many small employments. The wife's spinning wheel turned for the clothiers who put out wool and flax to be spun in the cottages for a few pennies the pound. There was knitting and lace-making in the places that knew it, and straw-plaiting, and the making of small wares, the web of cottage industry, by which a labouring family added a little to the wage from the fields. The children helped at these as soon as they were able, small fingers winding and plaiting and carding, every hand bringing in its mite. And of an evening the men might gather at the alehouse, the one resort and club of the working man, to sit over a mug of ale by the fire, to talk and argue and sing, to hear the news and strike the bargains, and find a little warmth and fellowship away from the crowded cottage. A penny spent there was a penny the family could ill afford, and many a wife waited anxiously for a husband who spent too long or too much, but it was, for the labourer, almost the only pleasure that was purely his own. And below her, in the basement, the kitchen is coming to life, for it has the longest day of any room in the house. The kitchen maids are up, blowing the banked fire back into flame, hauling water, scouring the pots left from the night before, setting the great kettles to heat. The cook will be down soon to begin her long campaign, for a house like this might feed 30 or 40 people across its various tables before the day is done, the family and their guests above, the upper servants in the steward's room, the lower servants in the hall, and there is bread to bake, and meat to dress, and a dinner of many dishes to prepare that will not be eaten until the afternoon. By the time the sky begins to pale beyond the windows, the house is already quietly and busily alive below the level of the ground and along its back passages, a hidden world of labour humming beneath the silence of the sleeping family, so that when at last the family does wake, it will seem to them that warmth and light and order and breakfast have simply appeared, as if by themselves, as they have appeared every single morning of their lives. and down across the dark fields in the cottage we glimpsed by its thread of smoke the day has already begun, and it has begun without bells and without servants and without any choice at all about the hour. The labourer's wife is the first awake, as she is every morning, for the fire is her charge and the fire must not go out. She slips from the bed she shares with her husband, and perhaps with the smallest child between them, out into the cold of the one room, and she crouches at the hearth in the near dark, and coaxes the banked embers of last night back into a flame, feeding it the precious sticks and turf, blowing gently until the small fire catches and a little light and a little warmth begin to push back the dark. By that light she begins the morning's work, the water to be fetched, the pot to be set on, the coarse bread to be got ready, while her husband rises in the cold and pulls on his worn clothes and his heavy boots, and eats what little there is, standing by the firelight before the day's labour. There is no warm water for them, and no help, and no leisure, and no soft hour of waking. There is only the cold and the small fire, and the work already waiting, and the grey light beginning at last to seep in around the wooden shutter that serves them for a window. By the time the sun is fully up, the labourer is already out in the fields, and his wife is already deep in the unending work of the cottage, while 1/4 of a mile away behind the pale stone walls, the family of the house sleep on. And it is worth dwelling a moment on that small fire, for the hearth was quite literally the centre of the cottage's existence in a way that no single fire in the house could ever be. In the house there were fires in every room that was used, a dozen of them and more, each warming its own separate space, so that warmth was everywhere and belonged to no one place. In the cottage there was the one fire, and around it all of life was gathered. It cooked the food, it warmed the room, it dried the wet clothes, it gave the only light of the long evenings. It was the place the family drew in around to eat, and to talk, and to work, and to sleep beside. To let it go out was a small disaster, for it must be kindled again from flint and steel or borrowed live from a neighbour, and so it was never quite let die but banked down each night under the ashes to be coaxed back each dawn, kept alive from day to day and year to year, the same fire, in a sense, burning a family's life through. The single hearth was the heart of the poor home in the plainest way, the one source of all the warmth and light and cooking the family had, tended like a living thing, guarded against the dark and the cold. And the family that gathered round it, gathered round the one good thing the cottage reliably gave, while up at the house the many fires burned in their many rooms, taken as much for granted as the air. Now let us go up the great staircase, into the snug and quiet world the family wake into, for they wake late, and they wake to comfort. Come into the best bedchamber, where the morning is held back by heavy curtains, drawn close around a tall bed, and by shutters and hangings at the windows. Here the master, or perhaps the mistress, lies deep in fine linen sheets and woolen blankets beneath an embroidered coverlet, and a fire already burns low in the grate, for the housemaid came in an hour ago, silent as a shadow, to light it before they should wake to any chill. There is no hurry here, none at all. The rich did not rise with the sun, for they had no need to. The day waited upon them, not they upon the day, and to lie abed of a morning was not laziness, but simply the privilege of those whose work was done by other hands. When at last the bell is rung beside the bed, the personal servant comes, the lady's maid or the gentleman's man, bringing heated water in a covered can, and the long and elaborate business of the morning begins. For to be dressed among the rich was not a quick and private act, but a slow attended ceremony, performed with the help of others in a heated room at whatever hour one pleased. Watch the lady at her toilette. First the washing, in warm water poured into a basin of fine china, with soap and soft cloths. Then the fresh shift of clean white linen, for clean linen, changed daily, was the age's true measure of being clean. Then the stays laced up the back by the maid, drawn to the fashionable shape. Then the petticoats and the hoops, if the day requires them, and over all the gown of silk or fine printed cotton, pinned and smoothed and adjusted. And then the hair, the longest labour of all, brushed and curled and pinned and dressed high, and powdered until it is pale, a structure that might take the better part of an hour to build, and would stand for a day or more. The gentleman's rising is its own ceremony, the shaving by his man, the fresh white linen, the breeches and the waistcoat and the fine coat, the hair powdered or the wig set just so, the buckled shoes. To rise and dress was, for such people, to be slowly and carefully assembled by the hands of servants into the finished and ornamented figure the world would see, and it was done in warmth, at leisure, with conversation, while the day waited patiently outside the curtained windows. There might be chocolate brought up, thick and dark and sweet, to be sipped in bed or at the dressing table before the rising was well begun. There was the fire crackling in the grate, lit an hour since by unseen hands. There was the soft light filtered through the curtains, the warmth, the quiet, the slowness of it all. Nothing pressed, nothing hurried. The morning was a thing to be eased into, an hour or more of waking and washing and dressing and being attended to in comfort and in warmth, with the long pleasant day waiting beyond the window whenever one should choose to enter it. And all the while, across the fields, the labourer has been 3 hours at his work, in clothes he pulled on in the dark in a moment, by a fire his wife had to coax from the embers. Come down now, while the family are still dressing, and let me show you the house itself, for the house is the first and plainest measure of the gulf between the two lives, and it is worth walking through slowly. Step into the hall, with its floor of polished stone, its high ceiling, the broad staircase rising into the light from the tall windows above. The air is warm now, for the fires are lit. Pass into the dining room, where the long table waits beneath its chandelier, the sideboard heavy with silver. On into the drawing room, the finest room in the house hung with silk, its walls bright with pictures in gilded frames, its chairs and settees arranged for company, a looking-glass over the chimney-piece doubling the light. Come and sit a moment in that drawing-room, for it repays the lingering. The chairs are deep and cushioned, drawn up about the fire and the low tables. The carpet is soft and glowing underfoot. The long windows look out across the terrace and the park to the blue distance. On the table stand small precious objects, a snuff-box, a china figure, a bowl of late roses from the garden, a work-basket with its silks. The fire throws its warmth across the room, and its light up into the gilded frames, where the painted ancestors look gravely down. It is a room made entirely for ease, for the pleasant idle passing of the hours in good company. Every object in it chosen for beauty or for comfort, and nothing in it for use or for need, and to sit in it of an afternoon, easy and idle and surrounded by lovely things, with nothing required of one and the day one's own, or the daily experience so far beyond anything the cottage could offer, that the two could scarcely be spoken of in the same breath. There is the library, lined with books bound in calf and gold, a globe in the corner, a fire burning. There is the parlour where the family sit when they are alone, and the best bedchambers above, and the lesser ones beyond, room upon room, each with its purpose, a house of fine and separate spaces, where a single family lived spread out across a great expanse of warmth and air and light. And everywhere there are beautiful objects gathered over generations and bought with the wealth of the land. There are carpets brought from Turkey and Persia, soft underfoot, glowing with colour. There is furniture of polished mahogany, made by skilled hands in the new clean lines of the age, cabinets and tables and chairs and tall clocks that chime the hours through the rooms. There is silver in plenty, candlesticks and salvers and dishes and bowls, the family plate that was a fortune in itself, locked away by the butler each night. There are pictures, portraits of ancestors in their finery, looking down from the walls, landscapes, and views of the house itself in its park. There are looking glasses that catch and multiply the light, and porcelain from China upon the shelves, and curtains of damask at the windows, and wax candles waiting in their holders for the evening. And there is, above all, space, high airy rooms kept simply for sitting in, for talking in, for being idle in, an ease and an amplitude so complete that those who lived within it scarcely saw it as luxury at all, but only as the ordinary and natural furniture of a life. This was the world the family came down to every morning of their lives and found waiting, warm and bright, and ordered as if it had made itself. And it is worth pausing simply to feel the two dwellings, for they spoke to all the senses, and to step from one into the other was to pass between two different worlds of sound and smell and air. The house within was a place of a particular quiet, a hush of space and order, the sounds in it soft and few, the tick and chime of the clocks, the crackle of the well-fed fires, the muffled tread of servants on the stairs, a distant note of music, the low voices of people at their ease. It smelled of beeswax and wood smoke and the faint sweetness of the candles, of the flowers the lady had cut, of good cooking drifting up from below, of clean linen and dried herbs in the presses. The air was warm and dry and still, and there was room in it to breathe, height overhead and space on every side, a sense of calm and amplitude that was itself a kind of luxury, the very atmosphere of ease. The cottage spoke to the senses in quite another tongue. It was a place of closeness and of mingled smells, the wood smoke that never quite found the hole in the roof, and hazed the low room and stung the eyes, the damp of the earthen floor and the clay walls, the smell of the pot on the fire, and of the bodies that lived and slept so near together, of the animals that were never far, of the tallow and the rushlight. The sounds of it were close and constant, the crackle and spit of the small fire, the cry of a child, the scrape of the spinning wheel, the talk in the one room where everyone was always within arm's reach of everyone else, the weather loud against the thin walls and the thatch. The air was close and often smoky, and either too cold or too near the fire, and there was no room in it, no space to draw apart, no quiet to be had, and to come from the still bright amplitude of the house into the smoky, crowded closeness of the cottage was to feel in the very lungs and on the very skin the distance between the two lives. And the house itself, that pale, handsome pile upon its rise, was not merely a place to live, but a statement built and shaped on purpose to declare the wealth and the taste and the standing of the family that owned it. This was a great age of building and improving among the landed, when families pulled down the old rambling houses of their grandfathers and raised in their place these new mansions of classical proportion, symmetrical and elegant, with their porticos and their fine staircases and their suites of well-proportioned rooms designed by architects in the fashionable taste, faced in dressed stone, set just so in the landscape to be seen and to command a view. And around the house the park was made to match it, the ground reshaped at vast expense, old hedges swept away and the land laid out in flowing lawns and artful clumps of trees and gleaming sheets of water, a landscape composed like a picture to set off the house and to be admired from its windows. All of it cost enormous sums, the building and the rebuilding and the improving, money poured out upon stone and timber and earth for the sake of beauty and display, to make of the house and its setting a visible monument to the family's place in the world. The cottage, by contrast, was built by no architect and made no statement at all beyond the bare fact of shelter, raised cheaply of the local clay and timber and thatch, as small as would serve, with no thought of beauty or proportion or display, only of keeping the weather out as cheaply as might be. And the two buildings, the composed and costly mansion and the rough cheap hut, stood at the two ends of the valley as the plainest possible statement, written in stone and in clay, of what each life was worth in the reckoning of the world. Now hold all of that in your mind, the warmth and the plenty and the room to breathe, and come back with me out across the wet fields to the cottage, and let the contrast do its quiet work, for here is the other half of the same valley, and the other half of the same age. The cottage is small, so small that all of it would fit, several times over, into the hall we have just left. Its walls are of clay daubed over a frame of timber, or of rough unmortared stone, and its roof is thatched dark and damp, and its floor is very likely of beaten earth, hard and cold, and a little uneven underfoot. Stoop a little to come in at the low door. Inside there is one room, or two if the family is fortunate, and into that single space the entirety of a life is folded. Here they cook and eat and sit and work and sleep, the parents and the several children all together, for there is nowhere else for any of them to go, and the things within it are few and plain and hard-won. There is a rough table, scrubbed pale, and a bench or two, and a stool, and a chest in the corner that holds nearly everything the family owns. There are a few cooking pots of iron, and a handful of wooden bowls and trenchers and horn spoons, and perhaps one or two precious things of pewter kept for show. There is a bed, or two beds, that the family shares, with coverings of whatever can be had. Consider how they slept, all of them, in that one small space. The parents in the one bed, the children in the other, or in a truckle bed, pushed beneath by day, or on pallets of straw on the floor, or up in the little loft beneath the thatch reached by a ladder if the cottage had one. The family within a few feet of one another, breathing the same close air, warmed by the nearness of one another's bodies in the cold. There was no privacy in it, none, no room a person could be alone in, no door to close upon oneself. A family of the poor lived its entire life, its quarrels and its loving, and its sickness and its dying, in the one shared room, in the constant presence of one another. It was crowded, and it was close, and it could be wearing, and it was also, in its way, a warmth, the human warmth of never being alone, that the family in their many separate chambers up at the house, each with a room and a bed to themselves, did not have, and perhaps did not miss. There are no carpets, and no pictures, and no books, for most here cannot read a word. There is no glass in the small window, only a wooden shutter to be closed against the weather and the night, so that to keep out the cold is also to keep out the light. The place is dim even by day, and close, and never quite warm in the corners, and never quite dry, the damp rising from the earthen floor and the cold pressing in at the walls, so that the one small fire is fought over by the cold and the wet on every side. The fire is the heart of the place, and the single chimney does not always draw, so the low room is often hazed with smoke that stings the eyes and blackens the thatch. And yet it is home, kept as decent and as clean as bone-deep want will allow, and the woman of the house labours without rest to keep it so, against the damp and the cold and the dirt and the constant, grinding nearness of not quite having enough. The same morning light that is filtering now through the damask curtains of the manor falls here through the cracks of a wooden shutter onto an earthen floor, and it is the same light, and the same morning, and the same green valley, and it could hardly fall upon two more different worlds. When the family at last come down, dressed and unhurried, there is breakfast waiting for them, and breakfast in such a house had grown into a thing of elegance and ease. Come into the room where it is set out in the morning light. There is tea, that costly and fashionable leaf locked away in its caddy and measured out with care, brewed and poured from a silver pot into cups of thin painted porcelain, or there is coffee or chocolate, rich and dark, for those who prefer it. There are rolls and toasted bread and fresh butter and honey and preserves, perhaps some cold meat or a little fish for a gentleman with an appetite, perhaps a cake. It is a lighter meal than the great dinner that will come in the afternoon, but it is a chosen one, taken slowly in a bright, comfortable room, with the morning's letters to be opened and read, and the newspaper to be looked over. A few days old by the time it reaches the country, but full of the doings of the town and the wider world. The making and the pouring of the tea was itself a small ritual of fashion, the equipage of it a pleasure in its own right, the silver teapot and the little caddy with its lock, the sugar in its bowl, the cream, the array of painted cups, the lady of the house presiding over it all and dispensing it to the company as a graceful office of her mourning. The family linger over it, talk over it, plan the small pleasures of the day over it, in no haste at all, and across the fields, in the cottage, breakfast, if it can be dignified with the name, was eaten long before in the half-dark, standing or perched at the rough table, swallowed quickly before the work. It was bread very likely, the coarse dark bread that was the foundation of the poor man's eating, and with it perhaps a little weak beer or only water, and on a good morning a scrap of cheese or a smear of dripping. There was no tea, for tea was a luxury, though the poor came to crave it, to spend on it what little they could. There was no porcelain, no silver pot, no newspaper, for few could read it, and none could spare the penny. There was no lingering, for the light was wanted in the fields, and the day's labour would not wait. The labourer ate to be able to work, and then he went out to the work, and that was breakfast, the same this morning as yesterday, and as it would be tomorrow. But let us go down for a while into the kitchen of the house, the hot-beating heart of the establishment, for the abundance we shall see upon the dinner table did not make itself, and the labour that produced it was as real, in its way, as any labour in the fields. The kitchen was a world of its own, below the level of the ground, or in its own wing, a high room hazed with smoke and steam and filled with heat, and over it the cook reigned with an authority second to none below stairs. The great range and the open fire roared all day, and before them the meat turned on the spits, basted and watched, the coppers and cauldrons steamed, the ovens baked the bread and the pies and the pastries. There were the kitchen maids fetching and chopping and plucking and scouring, the scullery maid up to her elbows in grease and cold water, at the endless washing of the pots, the boy turning the spit or carrying the coal. From this hot and crowded room came, hour by laborious hour, the many dishes of the family's dinner, each one made by hand from the raw materials of the estate, the beasts killed and butchered, the birds plucked and drawn, the vegetables from the garden, the flour ground at the mill, all of it transformed by skill and heat and unceasing toil into the elegant abundance that would be carried up and set out upon the white cloth above. The cook and her maids would labour the long day to produce a dinner that the family would consume in an hour or two and scarcely think upon, and then they would begin again upon the supper and then upon tomorrow. It was hard, hot, heavy work, paid as servants were paid, and it was the necessary engine beneath every glittering meal, the sweating reality below the stairs that made possible the cool plenty above them. And beyond the kitchen door lay the home farm, the working heart that fed the house, where another body of labour went on out of the family's sight. There was the dairy, cool and stone-floored and scrupulously clean, where the dairymaid set the milk in wide, shallow pans for the cream to rise, skimmed it, churned the butter, pressed and turned the cheeses, work that began before dawn, and went on in all weathers, for the cows must be milked whether or not it suited. There was the brew-house and the bake-house, the poultry-yard, the kitchen garden with its gardeners and its walls and its glass-houses coaxing fruit out of season, the pigsties and the slaughtering. From all of this flowed the raw plenty that the kitchen turned into the family's meals, the milk and the cream and the butter and the eggs and the fruit and the herbs and the meat, produced by skilled and constant labour, and carried into the house as though it appeared of itself. The family ate the cream without once thinking of the dairymaid's cold early hands, the fruit without the gardener's year of care, for the point and triumph of the arrangement was that the labour should be invisible and only the plenty seen. Let us go down now into the world below stairs, into the basement passages and the back rooms where the servants lived and laboured, for they were a society in themselves, as ranked and ordered and conscious of degree as the family they served. A house like this might keep a dozen indoor servants, or 24, or in the grandest houses many more, and every one of them had a fixed place in a strict hierarchy that governed where they ate, where they slept, what they wore, and how they were addressed. At the top stood the upper servants, the aristocracy of the basement, the house steward who ran the entire establishment and kept the accounts, the housekeeper who ruled the female servants and held the keys to the stores and the still room, the butler who commanded the dining room and guarded the wine and the precious plate, the cook who reigned over the kitchen, the lady's maid and the gentleman's own man who attended the persons of their master and mistress. These dined apart in the steward's room or the housekeeper's room, and were waited on, in their turn, by the lower servants, and below them came the great body of the household, the footmen in their livery, tall and well matched, who waited at table and carried and fetched and stood behind the chairs and rode behind the carriage, the housemaids who swept and dusted and polished and made the fires and the beds, the kitchen maids and the scullery maids scrubbing in the steam and grease below, the laundry maids at their coppers and irons, the dairy maid, the still-room maid, and out of doors the coachman and the grooms in the stables, the gardeners, the gamekeeper, the boys who did the rough and dirty work that no one else would touch. Each had a station, and each knew it, and the order among them was kept as jealously as any order above stairs. They rose first and slept last. They lived by bells and by orders, their days mapped out from the dark of the morning to the dark of the night. They were fed and housed under the roof or over the stables, and clothed in part, and paid a wage that was small but certain, a few pounds a year for the lower sort, and rather more for the upper, with the hope of vails and tips, and, in time, a better place. It was a hard life and a confined one, with little freedom and less privacy, all of it given over to the comfort and the grandeur of others. And yet a place in a good house was a thing to be sought and valued, far better and far safer than the lot of the labourer in the open fields, with a roof that did not leak, and food that did not fail, and a fire to sit by, so that the servant lived a third kind of life, between the ease of the family above and the raw want of the cottage below, belonging wholly to neither, the hidden engine that kept the golden world turning. Let it give that hidden engine a single face, and follow one of them through the day, the young housemaid we met first of all in the dark of the morning, for her day shows the life of service from the inside. She rose, as we saw, before anyone. In the cold attic she shared, and came down to the long round of fires and grates that began her work. Through the morning she swept and dusted and polished the rooms the family would use, and many they would not, on her knees at the hearths, reaching into the corners, carrying her heavy pails of water and coal up and down the back stairs that kept her out of the family's sight. For a good servant was meant to be invisible, the work done and the worker unseen. She made the beds and emptied the chamber pots and carried the cans of heated water. She would snatch her own meals quickly in the servants' hall, in their own strict order of precedence, and be back at her tasks. Through the afternoon and the evening there was more of the same, the endless keeping clean and keeping ready of a great house, the answering of bells, the carrying and the fetching, until at last, long after the family had gone up to their snug beds, She might climb the back stairs again to her cold attic and her shared bed, to sleep a few hours before the dark of another identical morning. Her wage was a handful of pounds in the year. Her hours were from before dawn to after dark. Her freedom was an afternoon now and then, and a rare visit home. And yet she was, by the measure of her world, fortunate, better fed, and better housed, and better sheltered than the labourer's daughter she might otherwise have been, with a roof that held and a fire in the kitchen, and the chance, if she was steady and lucky, of rising in time to be a housekeeper herself. And the servants had a world of their own below stairs, a society with its own life that went on out of the family's sight. In the servants' hall, where the lower servants took their meals, there was talk and laughter and gossip. The news of the family passed and judged. The small dramas of the household played out. The friendships and the rivalries and the romances that sprang up among young people thrown together in service. There was a strict order even here, the upper servants dining apart and grandly, the lower in the hall in their own descending rank. But there was also fellowship, the rough close community of people who shared the same long days and the same narrow lot. They had their half-days and their rare holidays, their hopes of a better place, or of saving enough one day to marry and keep a little shop or alehouse, their letters home, their few possessions in the box beneath the attic bed. It was a confined life and a hard one, lived in the service of others, but it was a life with its own pleasures and its own people, going on quietly beneath the grand life above, the great house holding within it, not one household but two, the families and the servants, the seen and the unseen, under the single roof. She was neither rich nor quite of the poorest, but something between, spending her one young strength to keep the golden world bright for those who lived in it. And above her in the order of the house stood the footmen, who were a luxury of a different and showier kind, kept as much for display as for use. They were chosen tall and well-made and well-matched, dressed in the family's livery, the coat of the house colours trimmed with lace, the breeches and the stockings and the buckled shoes, the hair powdered, a costume that turned the man himself into an ornament of the establishment. They waited at table, standing behind the chairs, handing the dishes, filling the glasses. They answered the door and carried the messages, and walked or rode behind the carriage. They lent their stately presence to the rooms and the journeys of the family. To keep a footman, and more than one, and to keep them fine, was a visible proof of wealth. For here was a strong man in the prime of his strength, employed not to labour, but largely to stand and to carry and to look well, his very idleness, compared to the labourer's toil, a kind of advertisement of the family's means. The same strength that, born in a cottage, would have been bent over a plough was here dressed in lace and set to hand the dishes, and the contrast was not lost upon the labourer, who knew very well what such a man could have done in a field, and who touched his hat to the powdered footman as to one set above him in the order of the world. And what of the family they served? Now that they are washed and dressed and breakfasted, how did the master pass his morning? Come with him into the library where a fire burns and the day's letters lie waiting on the desk. His morning, such as it was the morning of a man whose living was made for him by others, and it was filled not with labour, but with the management of his affairs and the gentle ordering of his pleasures. He reads his letters and his newspaper. He sees his steward, the man who runs the estate and goes over the business of the land, the rents that are due and the rents that are late, the repairs to a farmhouse, the felling of a wood, the dispute between two tenants, the price of corn, the management of the home farm. For the master's world rested upon the estate, that broad sweep of country rolling away on every side of the house, and it is worth understanding plainly how the wealth was made, because all the warmth and the silver and the wax candles flowed from it in the end. The estate was land, hundreds or thousands of acres of it, and that land was the source of everything. Some of it the family farmed themselves, the home farm that supplied the house. But most of it was let out, field by field and farm by farm, to tenant farmers who paid their rents to the master twice a year, and those tenant farmers in their turn hired the labourers, the men like the one we left out in the fields, to do the actual work of the soil. So the wealth flowed upward, in a steady stream, from the labour of the many to the comfort of the few. The labourer's sweat became the farmer's crop, and the farmer's crop became the master's rent, and the master's rent became the silk at the windows, and the silver on the table, and the wax candles burning bright through the long evening. The master did no work upon the land, and yet the land was the making of him. He lived in the plain truth of it, upon the labour of the valley, and the fine house upon its rise was built and warmed and filled and lit by hands that would never once sit down in its rooms. None of this was hidden, and none of it was thought wrong, for it was simply the settled order of the world, as that age understood it, a great chain of rank and degree reaching down from the king to the meanest cottager, each soul fixed in its place, the high-born to rule and to own, and the low-born to labour and obey. And the labourer in the field, straightening his back to look up at the house on the hill, very likely thought that order as old and as fixed and as natural as the turning of the seasons themselves. And consider how the two worlds moved about that valley and the wider country, for even the simple business of going from one place to another was a different thing for the rich and the poor. The house kept its stables, and the stables were a small kingdom of their own, the coachman and the grooms and the stable boys tending a string of fine horses, the carriage horses matched for colour and size, the riding horses, the hunters, and it kept its carriages, the coach for travelling and for state, hung upon its springs and lined with cushions, and perhaps a lighter chaise for the lady, and the apparatus of harness and livery that went with them. To travel, for the rich, was to be carried, to step from one's own door into a sprung and cushioned coach, sheltered from the rain and the wind and the dust, drawn by good horses, driven by a coachman with a footman or two riding behind, and to be conveyed in an hour, in comfort, a distance that would cost a man on foot the better part of a day. They went to visit to the assemblies, to the county town, to London for the season, and they went seated and warm and at their ease, the country rolling comfortably past the glass. The labourer travelled, as the poor had always travelled, upon his own 2 feet. He walked to the fields and walked home again. He walked to the church on a Sunday and to the market town on market day, miles there and miles back along the rutted and muddy lanes. If he must go further, to seek work or to see kin, he walked that too, in all weathers, his boots, if he owned boots, worn thin upon the stones. A poor man might live and die having never once in his life sat inside a carriage, never travelled faster than he could walk, never seen a town beyond the nearest. And when the gleaming coach of the family came bowling along the lane, the labourer would step back into the hedge to let it pass, and pull off his hat to the great folk going by, and the family behind their glass, if they noticed him at all, would see only a figure by the roadside, there and gone, while the same road carried them in comfort, and him in the mud, the one borne up and the other set aside. And the horses in those fine stables were kept as much for sport as for travel, for the hunting and the shooting that were among the chief pleasures of a gentleman's country life. On a hunting morning the stables came alive, the hunters saddled and led out, the gentleman in his riding dress, the hounds if it was the family's own pack, the long days hard galloping across the country after the fox, over the hedges and the ditches, the thrill and the danger and the high company of it. Well, there was the shooting, the walking up of the birds with the dogs and the keeper, the partridge and the pheasant brought down, the game that filled the larder and adorned the table. It was a healthy, vigorous, exhilarating pleasure, this sport, and it filled many a gentleman's autumn and winter days. and it was bound up with the pride of owning land, the right to ride and shoot across one's own broad acres and to take the game that was one's own by law. The labourer shared in none of it, except as the man who mended the fences the hunt broke down, or beat the coverts to drive the birds toward the gentleman's gun, or stood aside as the hunt came pouring across the field he had ploughed, trampling the crop he had sown. The same countryside that was the gentleman's playground was the labourer's workplace, and the same animals that were the gentleman's sport were, as we have seen, forbidden to the hungry man on pain of the law. He watched the bright cavalcade go by, the well-mounted riders and the streaming hounds. As he watched the carriage on the lane, from the edge of it, a working man pausing in his work to let the pleasures of his betters pass, and then he bent again to the furrow. And to travel any distance in that age was itself an adventure shaped by one's station. The rich went by their own carriage or by the post, putting up at the better inns along the road where they were bowed to and given the best rooms and the best of the table. The journey a thing of some comfort, even when the roads were bad and the going slow. The roads themselves were poor by our reckoning, rutted and dusty in summer and deep in mud in winter. The journeys long and jolting, and there was the real danger of the highwayman on the lonely stretches. But for the rich it was endured in cushioned comfort, with servants to see to everything. The poor man who must travel walked, as we have said, or if he were fortunate begged a lift upon a carrier's cart among the goods, slow and cheap and rough. He slept, if he could not reach his journey's end, in the cheapest corner of the meanest inn, or in a barn, or under a hedge. The same road carried the gentleman in his sprung coach to the best bedchamber of the inn, and the labourer on his own sore feet to the stable straw. The one journey a discomfort to be cushioned, and the other a hardship to be borne, and the inn that fawned upon the one had scarcely a glance for the other. And the mistress of the house, while her husband is closeted with his steward, has her own morning to order, and though it is a morning of comfort, it is not quite a morning of idleness, for the running of a great household was itself a real and demanding charge. After breakfast she meets with her housekeeper, and together they go over the business of the house, the meals to be planned, the stores to be checked, the linen, the preserving and the pickling in their season, the ordering of what must be bought, the management of the many female servants, the small economies and the large expenses of a house that fed and clothed and sheltered dozens. She keeps her own accounts, for a good mistress knew to a nicety what her household cost. She visits her still room, where the cordials and the preserves and the simple medicines were made. She writes her letters to her relations and her friends in other houses near and far, for letters were the thread that held together the wide web of the gentry, carrying news and invitations and the small currency of kindness across the counties. And then, the morning's duties done, she is free, and her freedom is the truest luxury she owns. She may sit to her needlework, the fine embroidery that was an art and an ornament rather than a labour. She may practise at the harpsichord, or read, or walk in the garden, or receive a morning caller come to sit a polite half-hour. Her time, once the housekeeper is dismissed, is a garden she may wander in as she pleases, and that possession of one's own hours, to fill with beauty or with rest or with nothing at all, was a wealth as real as any silver, and one the woman in the cottage would not taste for a single waking hour in all her life. And yet we should not make of the family a mere pair of idle figures gilded by their fortune, untouched by any care, for they were people too, with their own burdens beneath the ease, and a true picture must allow them that. The master carried the weight of his estate and his name, the management of the land and the debts that even great families ran up, the duty to keep up the house and the standing his fathers had left him, and to pass them on undiminished, the anxieties of money and inheritance, and the marrying off of children that pressed even upon the rich. The mistress carried the running of a great and demanding household, and the long constraint of a life lived always within the narrow bounds set for a woman of her rank, expected to be ornamental and agreeable and fruitful and little else, her abilities given small scope, her days, for all their comfort, often empty of any real purpose or use. And wealth, as the wise in every age have known, did not of itself bring happiness. There was boredom in those fine rooms, and loneliness, and grief that the physician could not cure, and the silver could not soften, and the same human sorrows of love and loss, and disappointment, and fear of death that visit every life under the sun, rich or poor. The family wanted for nothing the world could supply, and yet they could be unhappy, as the comfortable have always been able to be unhappy, and their ease, real as it was not the same thing as contentment. It would be wrong to pity them who had so much, but it would be wrong too to imagine that the warmth and the plenty and the leisure brought them any exemption from the deeper troubles of being alive, for those came to the house upon the hill as surely as they came to the cottage in the fields, and made, in the end, a quiet common ground between the two beneath all the vast inequality of their outward lives. And the daughters of the house lived a life that, for all its silk and leisure, was hedged about with its own narrow walls. A young lady was reared to be an ornament and a wife, taught her music and her drawing, and her French and her needlework, her dancing and her graceful carriage, accomplishments meant to make her pleasing and marriageable, rather than to feed any purpose of her own. She could not work, could not study deeply, could not go about freely or alone, could not choose her own course. Her future turned upon making a good marriage, and to that end she was brought out into society at the proper age, and shown, almost as the goods at the fair were shown in the assemblies and the drawing-rooms, and above all the season in town, the marriage market of the great world. A good match, a husband of fortune and family was the prize, settled half by the heart, and half by the lawyers and the parents, with their settlements and their dowries. It was a gilded life, and a sheltered one, and beside the labouring woman's it was ease itself, and yet it was also a cage, the cage of a woman with abilities and no scope to use them, valued for her face, and her fortune, and her conduct, and very little else, her life laid out for her before she was grown, with no more real say in its great matters than the cottage girl had in hers. For now we must go out to that other life, out past the park wall and into the fields, where the labourer has been at work since before we first looked into the manor, and where the real and bodily labour of the valley is done. Come and stand a while at the edge of the field and watch him, for this is the work that fed everyone, the rich and the poor alike, and it never stopped. The labourer's day was governed not by the clock, but by the light and the season, for the labourer kept time by the sun and the seasons and the call of the bell over the fields, rising and resting and working by the light God gave, the long days of summer and the short ones of winter, setting the very length of his labour, the year telling him by its turning what must be done and when. The house kept time differently, by the clock, the fine clocks that stood and chimed in its rooms and divided the day into measured hours, the family rising and dining and visiting by the hour rather than the sun, their time a thing they parcelled out and filled at will. The one lived in the old time of nature, the turning year and the rising sun and the tolling bell, the other in the new time of the clock, the measured and ordered hour, and even in this, in the very reckoning of the passing day, the two worlds stood apart. The labourer's day was long, from first light to last, 6 days in the week, in every weather the English year could throw down. In the spring there was the ploughing. The heavy plough dragged through the clinging earth behind the straining horses or oxen, the man leaning his whole weight to hold it true. Mile upon mile of furrow walked in the cold and the wet. Feel what that work was in the body. The cold of the early morning that ached in the fingers and the feet, the wet that soaked through the worn clothes and was not dry again all day, the clay of the field that clung to the boots and to the share in heavy clots, and had to be cleared by hand, the strain in the arms and the back and the shoulders of holding the plough true hour upon hour, the rawness of the hands on the wet wood and leather. And this not for an hour, but for the length of the short winter daylight, day upon day, and the same body called out again the next morning before it had rightly rested, and the next, the labour written into the very flesh of the man, the bent back and the knotted hands, and the early ageing that marked the bodies of those who worked the land. Above the labourer stood the tenant farmer who hired him, and above the farmer the steward, and twice in the year the structure came to a head on the rent day, when the tenants gathered at the house to pay what they owed. It was a day of some ceremony. The farmers come in their best, shown into the steward's room or the great hall, the accounts gone over, the rents handed across in coin or promised, the master perhaps appearing to give a word and a glass of ale, a dinner laid on for the tenants as was the custom. For the farmer it was the great reckoning of his year, the proof of whether he had prospered or fallen behind, the rent that must be found whatever the harvest had been. A good year, and he paid easily, and kept his farm. A run of bad ones, and he might fall into arrears and lose it. And beneath the farmer, unseen at the rent day, stood the labourer, whose work had grown the crop that paid the rent, getting none of the credit and none of the land, only his few shillings a week whether the farmer prospered or failed. The money flowed up through the three of them, labourer to farmer to master, on the rent day made visible, the broad base of labour at the bottom, and the family at the top, and the pyramid resting, as it always rested, upon the hands that actually worked the soil. And the land itself was changing in those years in a way that pressed hard upon the poor, for this was the great age of enclosure, when the old open fields and the common lands were being fenced and hedged and parcelled out into private holdings. For centuries much of the country had lain in open fields farmed in common strips, with broad commons and wastes beside them, where even the poorest cottager had his customary rights to graze a cow or a few geese, to gather furze and turf for his fire, to glean the fields after harvest, to take a little from the common store of the land. These rights were no charity, but ancient custom, and they were the very margin upon which many a poor family survived, the cow on the common that gave the children milk, the fuel gathered free, the goose fattened on the waste. Now, by Act of Parliament, estate by estate, the commons were enclosed, the open fields divided, hedged, and made the private property of the larger landowners, who farmed them more efficiently and more profitably than before. For the master and the larger farmers, enclosure was improvement, more land more profitably worked, larger rents, a tidier and more productive estate. For the cottager it was very often ruin, for when the common was enclosed his customary rights upon it vanished, the cow he could no longer graze was sold, the fuel he could no longer gather must now be bought. The small independence that had stood between his family and bare wage labour was taken away with little or nothing given in return. Enclosure made the rich man richer and the poor man poorer and more dependent, stripping from the labouring family the old cushion of common right, and leaving it with nothing but its hands and its wage, more wholly at the mercy of the farmer and the market than ever before. The same fields, the same valley, but the hedges going up across the old commons were drawing the line between the two worlds harder and deeper, fencing the poor out of a share in the land that had once, in custom at least, been partly theirs. There was the sowing, the seed cast by hand from the basket at the hip, with the old broad swinging stride. Through the summer there was the endless tending, the weeding and the hoeing, the hay to be cut with the scythe and turned and carried back-breaking labour against the threat of rain. And in the late summer came the harvest, the great crisis and climax of the year, when every hand was needed and the corn was cut and bound and stacked from dawn to dark in a long, desperate race to get it in dry before the weather broke. It was hard work, the hardest there was, done with the body and paid for in the body, and the wage it earned was thin. A farm labourer might be paid a shilling or so a day, a few shillings in the week, barely enough to feed and house a family, and nothing at all to lay by against sickness or age or the lean months of winter when work was scarce. He had, if he was lucky, his cottage and a scrap of garden. He had his strength, which was his only true capital, and which the work itself slowly spent. And he had the knowledge, sitting always at the back of his mind, that there was no cushion beneath him, that a bad harvest or a long illness or an injury in the field could tip the family from getting by into real and hungry want. He worked alongside other men, and there was company in it, and skill, and a rough pride in a furrow well ploughed or a rick well built, and the talk and the songs that lightened the labour. But the labour did not end, and it did not change, and it did not lead anywhere but to more of the same. It was the unvarying condition of his life. From the time he was a boy strong enough to be useful, until the time he was an old man too broken to be kept on, and through all of it the house stood there on its rise above him, warm and bright and easy, built upon the very work of his hands. And of all the labours of his year it was the harvest that was the greatest, the long crisis upon which everything turned, and it is worth standing in the field through it, for it shows the working life at its fullest stretch. When the corn stood ripe and golden in the late summer, the strength of the valley was thrown into getting it in, for upon the harvest hung the bread of the coming year, and a harvest lost to the weather meant hunger for everyone below. From the first light to the last, day after day, the men swung the sickles and the scythes through the standing corn, and behind them the women and the children gathered and bound the sheaves, and stood them in stooks to dry, the work going on as long as there was light to see by, in the heat and the dust and the aching toil. It was the hardest work of the hardest working life, and it was also, strangely, a time of a kind of fierce communal gladness, for the community laboured together at it, and there was extra food and extra drink to keep the harvesters going, and the deep satisfaction of the crop coming safely in. And when the last sheaf was cut and the last load carried, there came the harvest home, the great feast that crowned the year, when even the farmer or the master opened his hand and gave his harvesters a supper, meat and bread and ale in plenty, and a night of music and rough dancing and song in the barn, the one time in the year when the labourers ate their fill and rested, and made merry at their betters' expense. The gleaners came after, the poorest women and children, allowed into the cut fields to gather the fallen ears that were left, a hard-won handful of extra grain. Picture them, the poorest women of the parish, bent in the stubble of the cut fields in the autumn light, their children beside them, gathering one by one the ears the harvesters had dropped or missed, an ancient right of the poor grudgingly allowed, the gleaning that might add a few precious pounds of grain to the winter store. It was stooping, patient, humble work, the very gathering up of the leavings, and the women who did it were the poorest of all, the widows and the wives of the lowest labourers, for whom even those scattered ears were worth the long bent hours of gathering them. And while they gleaned the fallen grain in the cut fields, the corn they gleaned from went up in great loaded wagons to the farmer's barn, and from the farmer to the market, and from the market, in the end, to the table of the great house as fine white bread. And the same harvest that filled the house with plenty sent the poorest women of the valley creeping after it, across the stubble, for the few ears that plenty had let fall. And then the year turned down toward the autumn, and the winter the ploughing began again for the next year's crop, and the long round started over, the same as it had been for the labourer's father and his father before him, the endless turning of the agricultural year upon which the valley, the cottage and the grand house alike in the end entirely depended. For the life of the valley turned upon the wheel of the year, and that turning was felt very differently in the two houses. In the cottage the year was a thing of labour and of weather, and of careful survival, each season bringing its own work and its own want and its own small relief. The spring brought the ploughing and the sowing and the lengthening days, and the first green things in the garden, after the long hunger of the winter's end, the hardest time of all, when the stores were gone and the new crops not yet come. The summer brought the long days of growing and tending, and the great labour of the hay, and a little more ease as the gardens gave, and the days were warm and the fuel less needed. The autumn brought the harvest and its crisis and its feast, and the killing of the pig and the salting down against the cold to come, the one season of relative plenty, and the winter brought the dark and the cold and the fear, the short days and the failing fire and the dwindling food, the season simply to be survived. In the house the same year turned, but it turned as a round of pleasures and removals rather than of labour and want. The spring and the early summer might be the season in town, the round of fashionable gaiety, the late summer and the autumn the return to the country, the sport, the hunting and the shooting, the visiting and the entertaining, the harvest watched from the comfort of the house. The winter was Christmas, and its feasting and its warmth, the snug evenings by the fire, the season looked at through the window for its beauty, the very same procession of months that meant to the cottage ploughing and hunger and harvest and cold, meant to the house town and sport and Christmas and ease. The one read the year in labour and the other in pleasure, and the wheel that turned them both turned the two lives in opposite directions, the work of the one paying always for the leisure of the other. And his wife, back in the cottage, was bound to a labour every bit as long and as hard as his, though it was labour of a different kind, the endless invisible work of keeping a poor family alive. Her day, which began before his with the lighting of the fire, did not pause when he went out to the fields. It simply went on task upon task, from dark to dark. There was water to be fetched, every drop of it, carried in heavy pails from the well or the stream, for cooking and washing and drinking. And that fetching of the water was itself a labour we should not pass over lightly, for there was no tap and no pump within the cottage, and each drop the family used had to be carried to it by hand out to the well, or the spring, or the stream, however far it lay, and back again with the full pails heavy on the yoke or dragging at the arms, and out again, as many times in the day as the cooking and the washing and the drinking and the beasts required, in all weathers, the path worn and muddy, the water slopping and spilling, the work falling chiefly on the women and the children. Water was heavy, and it was wanted constantly, and the carrying of it was one of the endless small toils that filled the cottage day, taken so for granted that it was scarcely thought of as work at all, and yet costing real labour each day of a life. In the house, water appeared as everything appeared, brought by servants, the heated water carried up in cans to the bedchambers, the kitchen supplied, the labour of the carrying done out of sight by other hands. The family turned to find it there, warm and ready, and never once carried a pail in their lives. There was the fire to be fed and tended and never let go out, and the fuel to be gathered, the sticks and the furs and the turf hoarded and counted against the cold. There was bread to be made, the coarse loaves that were the family's chief food, mixed and kneaded and baked in the ashes, or carried to the village oven. There was the cooking of the one pot, the pottage that simmered on the fire. There was washing, done by hand with hard soap and cold water, and a great deal of toil, and mending, for the few clothes had to last for years. And there was the garden, and the pig in its sty, and the hens, which were not a hobby, but a part of the family's very survival, the few vegetables and the bacon and the eggs that stood between them and hunger, all of it her charge to tend. And woven through all of it, all day and every day, were the children, the babies to be nursed and minded, the small ones underfoot, the older ones to be set to their own tasks and watched. And when the great labours of the household paused, there was still no rest, for then she took up the spinning, the wheel turning under her foot, and the thread drawing out between her fingers, hour after hour by the firelight, spinning wool or flax for the few extra pennies it might bring, because a few extra pennies could mean the difference between just enough and not enough. Her work had no boundaries and no end. It filled every waking hour and followed her into the night. It was never finished, because the moment one task was done, another was already waiting, and it would begin again, exactly the same, the moment she woke. She had no servant, and no leisure, and no hour she could call her own, and she did it all on too little food, and too little sleep, and too little of everything, and she did it all her life, with a strength and an endurance that the lady up at the house, sitting now at her embroidery in the snug drawing-room, could scarcely have imagined and would never be called upon to find. And let me say something of dress, and of the look of the two, for a person's clothes in that age announced their station to every eye that fell upon them, and the gulf showed as plainly in what people wore as in anything else. Among the rich, dress was an art and a statement and a daily labour, and it required a wardrobe and the hands of servants to manage. A lady of the house owned many gowns of silk and satin and fine printed cotton, for morning and for dinner and for the evening and for the great occasions, with all that went beneath and around them, the shifts and the stays and the petticoats, the stockings of silk, the gloves, the caps and the hats, the shawls and the cloaks, the shoes and the fans and the few good jewels. Her clothes were made for her by mantua makers, and kept and cleaned and mended and altered with the turning fashions, and to be dressed in them was the long-attended ceremony we have already watched. A gentleman, too, went in fine cloth and clean linen, his coat well cut, his waistcoat embroidered, his linen white as snow and changed each day, his hair dressed and powdered. To be richly and correctly dressed was to wear one's wealth and one's rank upon one's very body for all the world to read at a glance. The labourer and his wife owned, very likely, the clothes they stood up in, and one set besides kept for Sundays, and that was all of it. His were of coarse, strong stuff made to take hard wear, a smock or a coat of fustian, breeches, thick stockings, heavy-nailed boots if he was fortunate, and clogs or bare feet if he was not, all of it patched and patched again, and worn until it fell to rags, and then the rags handed down to a child or used about the house. Her gown was of plain woolen stuff or coarse linen, with an apron over it, and a cap upon her head and a shawl against the cold, the same garments worn season upon season, washed and mended and made to last for years. They dressed in moments, because there was so little to put on, and what they had was made not for show but for work and for warmth, chosen for how long it would last and how well it would keep out the weather, and a poor woman might wear the same gown, turned and patched for the better part of her grown life. The fine silk and the patched wool, the daily changed white linen, and the one shirt worn till washing day, told the same plain story that everything else in the valley told, and the house was filling in those years with a new abundance of bought things that money could now command, for this was an age when trade was bringing the goods of the wider world within reach of those who could pay. There was tea from China and sugar from the West Indies to sweeten it, the two together becoming the great new indulgence of the age. There was coffee and chocolate, and tobacco, and the fine painted porcelain, and printed cottons and silks, and 100 manufactured goods and ornaments and conveniences that earlier generations had never known. The rich bought freely of all of it, the new luxuries and the new comforts, the house filling with the products of trade and empire, the table and the tea tray, and the wardrobe all enriched by goods carried half across the globe. It was a rising tide of things, of consumption, of getting and spending, and the family rode it easily, adding the new pleasures to the old, The poor stood almost wholly outside this new world of goods, pressing their faces, as it were, against the glass of it. The one new thing that reached even the cottage was tea, which the poor came to crave and to buy in the tiniest quantities, brewed weak and sweetened if sugar could be had, a small warm comfort that the moralists scolded them for as an extravagance they could not afford, though it was almost the only small luxury their lives allowed. For the rest, the new abundance passed them by. They made or grew or did without, as they always had, while the goods of distant lands flowed past them into the houses of the rich. The same trade that filled the great house with china and silk and sugar gave the labourer, at most, a few leaves of cheap tea, and the widening river of things that was beginning to remake the life of those who could buy, left the poor very much where it had always found them. And the news of the wider world reached the two ends of the valley as unequally as everything else reached them. The family had the newspapers carried out from the town, full of the doings of Parliament and the court and the war and the markets and the fashionable town. They had their wide correspondence, the letters going back and forth by the post among their relations and friends across the counties, carrying news and invitations and the web of their connection. They knew, however slowly, what passed in the nation and beyond it, and they felt themselves part of a great nation, reaching far beyond their fields. The labourer knew almost nothing of all this, and had little means and less time to learn it. What news came to him came by word of mouth, from the pedlar and the carrier, and the talk at the alehouse and the church porch, slow and garbled and chiefly of local things, a marriage, a death, a fair, a hanging at the county town, the price of bread. The great events of the nation reached him late and dim, if they reached him at all, a king's death, a battle won or lost. A new tax felt chiefly when they touched his own narrow life. The one lived in the broad current of the nation's affairs, the other in the small still pool of his own parish, and the very knowledge of the wider world, like its goods and its comforts, gathered at the top of the valley and ran thin by the time it reached the bottom. And here, in the matter of the children, the two worlds part most painfully of all, for childhood itself was a different thing on either side of the park wall, almost a different country. Up at the house the children lived in a world apart from the grown people, up on the nursery floor under the care of a nurse, and then a nursery maid, in snug rooms set aside for them alone. As babies they were fed and tended and kept clean and safe, watched over every hour. As they grew they passed into the schoolroom, the girls to a governess who taught them to read and write and figure a little, and to draw and to play and to sing, and above all to be ladylike, to move and speak and behave as their station required. The boys to a tutor and then away to school, to be drilled in their Latin and their Greek, and made into gentlemen. Their days were a long sheltered round of lessons and play, of meals brought up to them, of fresh air taken in the safety of the park, of new clothes as they outgrew the old, all of it in warmth and plenty, watched and guarded and provided for. Their childhood was a thing they were allowed to have, a long protected season of growing, a careful preparation for the comfortable and ordered life that lay waiting for them ahead. A day in the nursery of the house ran by its own gentle clock, the children waking to a fire already lit, and a nurse to wash and dress them, breakfast brought up, lessons with the governess through the morning, a walk in the park, or play in the nursery, dinner, more lessons or music or drawing, supper, and bed in a snug room with someone to tuck them down, all of it ordered and safe and provided, a childhood that was allowed to be a childhood. The cottage child's day ran by the same clock as its parents', up in the cold, a piece of bread, and out to whatever work its small strength could do, the bird scaring, or the stone gathering, or the minding of the baby, or the geese, a long day of real and useful labour, home at dark to the pot and the firelight and the shared bed. The one child played at life and was slowly prepared for it. The other lived it from the start, working beside the grown people almost as soon as it could walk. Its childhood folded into the labour of the family because the family could not spare it any other kind. The children of the cottage had no such season. They were loved as dearly as any children anywhere, but they could not be sheltered, for there was nothing to shelter them with, and they were set to work almost as soon as they could walk and understand. A child of 5 or 6 was old enough to be useful, to scare the birds from the new-sown field with a clapper and a shout, to mind the geese, to gather sticks and stones, to rock the baby, to fetch and carry. As they grew, the work grew with them, harder and longer, until by the time they were 10 or 12 they were doing a near-grown share, the boys going to the fields with their fathers, the girls helping their mothers or sent away into service in another's house, into the long apprenticeship of labour that would be the sum of their lives. They learned, most of them, no letters at all, for there was neither the means nor the time nor often the use, and a poor child who could not read grew into a poor adult who could not read and thought nothing strange in it. And they died, far more of them than the children of the rich, for the cold and the hunger and the close smoky room and the fevers of the age fell hardest upon the poorest, and the smallest and the weakest, and there was scarcely a cottage in the land that did not know the grief of the small grave, the empty place by the fire, the child who sickened in the winter and was gone by the spring. The same years that gave the children of the house their sheltered, lettered, well-fed growing, gave the children of the cottage their early labour and their thin chances under the one sky, in the one valley, 1/4 of a mile apart. But come back now to the house, for the sun has climbed to its height and the hour of the dinner is approaching, and nowhere, in the long day, does the gulf between the two worlds open wider than at the table. For the dinner in a Georgian house of any standing was the chief event and the chief glory of the day, served not in the evening as we serve it, but in the early afternoon, and made into a long and ceremonious affair. The kitchen has been labouring toward it since dawn. Now the footmen carry it up, dish after dish, and set it out upon the white damask cloth in the fashion of the age, an array brought to the table together for the company to see and to help themselves and one another, a small landscape of plenty, laid out under the light of the tall windows. Walk the length of that table with your eye, and see what was upon it. There is meat in abundance, the heart of an English dinner, roasted and boiled and baked into pies, beef, mutton, veal, a ham, fowls and ducks and geese, and game from the estate in its season, the pheasant and the partridge and the hare. There is fish, carried up from the coast packed in straw, or taken from the house's own ponds and the river. There are vegetables from the kitchen garden and the hothouse, and sauces and made dishes of every kind, and white bread as fine as the cook can bake it, and fresh butter, and several cheeses. And then the second course, and the sweet things, the puddings and the tarts and the custards and the syllabubs and the jellies trembling on their dishes, the preserved fruits, the fresh fruits from the garden walls and the glass house, the nuts, the sweetmeats, and the manner of the serving was itself a ceremony. The first course stood upon the table for the company to help themselves and one another, and then it was cleared away entire by the footman, and a second course of as many dishes set down in its place. And after that the cloth itself was drawn off the table and the dessert laid upon the bare polished wood, the fruits and the sweet things and the wine, the company sitting on in candlelit ease over the nuts and the glasses while the talk flowed. The footman stood ready throughout, changing the plates, filling the glasses, carrying and removing, silent and watchful at the edges of the pleasure they served but never shared. There is wine, and there is good ale, and all is served and cleared and replaced by the watchful footman under the eye of the butler. It is far, far more than the few people at the table could ever eat, and that abundance was the very point and meaning of it, for plenty itself was the display, the overflowing table, a standing proof of the wealth and the standing and the hospitality of the house. What the family and their guests left, and they left a great deal, went down to feed the upper servants, and what those left went to the lower servants, and what remained even then might be carried out to the poor who came to the kitchen door. To sit at that table was to live in a world where food was pleasure and ceremony and ornament, where one ate not because one was hungry, but because eating was one of the pleasant businesses of a leisured life, and where the only limit upon what one took was one's own appetite and the manners of the day. And now cross the fields again, in your mind, to the cottage, where the family are taking their own dinner, and let the two tables sit side by side in your thoughts. The labourer has come in from the field for a short space, or has had his food carried out to him at the field's edge. The family gather to what there is, and what there is little and plain, and very nearly the same every day of the year. The foundation of it, as of every meal, is bread, the coarse dark loaf of barley or rye that filled the belly and did the heaviest part of the feeding. With it there is pottage, the thick soup of the poor, made of whatever the garden gives, the cabbages and the peas and the beans and the onions and the herbs, thickened with a little oatmeal, simmered all the morning over the fire. And if the week has been good, there is a small piece of bacon from the pig boiled in it to lend it savour and strength. There is cheese, perhaps, and small beer to drink, weak and safe where the water might not be, and that is the dinner, and it is enough to live on and to work on, but it is barely enough, and there is rarely any to spare. Meat, fresh meat, such as covered the table up at the house, was a rare thing here, a luxury for a feast day, and not the daily fare it was for the rich. A labouring family might taste fresh killed meat only a handful of times in a year. The wife served the food out with care, for there was never quite enough, and the children were always a little hungry, the growing always outrunning the supply, and behind every meal stood the knowledge of how easily it could fail, for the poor lived close to the edge of want, and a bad harvest that sent the price of bread soaring, or a lost pig, or a sick cow, or a winter of no work, could tip a family from this plain sufficiency into real hunger, the gnawing daily hunger that was never far from the door of the poor. They ate quickly, and they ate to live, and they were grateful when there was enough, and then the labourer went back to the field and the wife back to her endless work, while up at the house the company were still only halfway through their many dishes, and rising at last from the table, not because the food was gone, for it was never gone, but because they had had their pleasant fill, and grace was said over both tables. The same few words of thanks to the same God, over the laden board of the house, and over the bread and the pottage of the cottage. But the thanks meant a different thing in the two mouths, a graceful form in the one, and, in the other, the real and heartfelt gratitude of people who knew that enough was never to be taken for granted, and that tomorrow it might not be there. It is worth lingering a moment over what filled the cups and what stocked the larders, for the drink and the keeping of food were their own quiet measure of the distance between the two. Up at the house there was a hidden world of provisioning that the family never saw. There was the still room, the housekeeper's domain, where the preserves were made and the fruits bottled, the cordials and the syrups and the home-made wines, the cakes and the sweet things, the simple medicines. There was the dairy, cool and clean, where the milk from the home farm was set and skimmed and the butter churned and the cheeses pressed. There was the brew-house, where the household's ale was brewed in quantity, and there were the cellars, and this was the heart of a gentleman's pride, stocked with wine brought from France and Portugal and Spain, the claret and the port and the Madeira laid down in their bins to mature, all of it guarded by the butler and brought up bottle by bottle to the table. The rich drank wine with their dinner and their supper, and tea and coffee and chocolate through the day, all of it costly, all of it a pleasure as much as a sustenance. In the cottage there was small beer, weak and thin, brewed at home from the cheapest materials or bought by the jug, safer than the water, and giving a little comfort and a few calories and not much else. And there was water, from the well or the stream, which might or might not be wholesome. Tea, that the rich took so freely, the poor came to long for, and to buy when they could in the smallest twists, brewing it weak and reusing the leaves, for it was a warm comfort in a cold life, even if it fed them nothing. There was no wine, no cellar, no still room, no dairy of their own, perhaps a single cow shared or none. What the cottage ate and drank it grew, or gathered or bought with pennies it could ill spare, and it was plain, and it was little, and it was the same from week to week. And the idea of laying down a store of anything against the future was, for most, simply impossible, because there was never anything left over to lay down. And underneath everything we have seen, the food and the fire and the clothes and the carriages, ran the plain hard fact of money, and the two worlds reckoned in money on scales so different, they can scarcely be set side by side. The income of a landed family might run to thousands of pounds in the year, flowing in from the rents of the estate, and out of it they kept the house and the servants and the carriages and the stables and the table and the wardrobe and the season in town, spending freely upon comfort and pleasure and display, and counting, when they counted at all, in pounds and in guineas. A single fine gown, a single good horse, a single evening's loss at the card table might cost more than a labourer would earn in a year or in several years. For the labourer reckoned in pennies. His wage was a few shillings in the week, and there are 12 pennies in a shilling, and every penny of it was spoken for before it was earned. So much for bread, so much for rent, so much for fuel, a little for the few necessaries that could not be made or grown. There was nothing over, or next to nothing, and so there was no saving, no cushion, no margin. The poor lived from week to week, and from harvest to harvest, always within a hand's breadth of want, and a rise in the price of bread or a spell of sickness or a hard winter could throw the careful reckoning into ruin. They knew the price of everything in pennies and farthings, and they knew to the last coin how little stood between them and going without, and they handled money rarely and in the smallest amounts, while up at the house it flowed in and out by the £100, scarcely noticed, the very same coin of the realm meaning two such utterly different things at the two ends of the one valley. And yet between the two ends of that valley there ran, alongside all the distance and all the inequality, a real thread of obligation and of charity, for the order of that age held not only that the high should rule the low, but that they should, in their fashion, care for them. The family at the house gave, there were the doles at the door, the broken meats from the great table carried out to the poor who came for them, the bread and the coals given at Christmas, the blankets and the clothes. There was the lady of the house who visited the cottages of the sick and the lying in, bringing broth and wine and small comforts and a kind of gracious notice, and who might pay for a child's schooling or a man's medicine. There were the established charities, the almshouses, some families founded, the relief given in a hard winter or after a bad harvest. It was real, and it eased real suffering, and it was felt by both sides to be a part of the natural order, the duty that came with the privilege. But it was charity, not justice, given from above as a gift and not owed as a right, and it left the arrangement of the valley exactly as it was, the giver still high and the receiver still low, the one bestowing and the other grateful. The gentry for the most part looked upon the poor with a mixture of real kindness and unconscious distance as people of another and lesser order, to be helped when deserving and deplored when not, to be kept in their place and cared for within it, but never to be raised out of it, for the place itself was thought to be ordained. The poor took what was given, with thanks that were sometimes heartfelt and sometimes the mere necessary coin of dependence, and they kept their own counsel beneath it. The hand reached down from the house to the cottage, and there was warmth in that hand and bread in it, but it reached down, always down, and never once pulled the cottage up to the level of the house, nor was it ever meant to. The afternoon, up at the house, belonged to pleasure, and to the gentle and unhurried filling of hours that did not need to be filled with anything useful at all, and this, more than the food or the fine rooms, was the truest luxury the rich possessed, the ownership of their own time. With the long dinner done, the company rose and scattered to their amusements through the bright afternoon. The gentlemen might call for their horses and ride out across the park and the estate, to look at the land or simply for the pleasure of the air and the movement, or take their guns and their dogs out after the game that was theirs by right over their own broad acres, or sit on over the wine, talking of horses and politics and the affairs of the county. The ladies might walk out into the garden, or take the air in the carriage along the lanes, bowing to the neighbours they passed, or settle to the fine needlework that was half an art and half a pastime, or gather in the drawing-room where a daughter might play upon the harpsichord, and another sing, filling the bright room with music as the afternoon light softened and lengthened. And there were the small social pleasures that filled such days and made them pass so agreeably. The cards laid out on the green baize, the cup of tea taken in the late afternoon as the fashion was coming to be, the books from the library, the letters written to absent friends, the easy flowing talk of people with nothing they were obliged to do, and all the day in which to not do it. And there were visitors, for the country house lived by its hospitality, and the neighbouring gentry came and went, to dine, to drink tea, to stay a night or a week, so that the afternoon filled easily and pleasantly with company and conversation, and the comfortable small business of a leisured and sociable life. Time here was not a master but a possession, a thing the rich owned as surely as they owned their acres, to be spent as they pleased upon beauty and ease and one another, and that ownership of one's own hours was perhaps the deepest difference of all between the house upon the hill and the cottage down in the fields. And the rich did not stay always in the country, for the year of a landed family had its own rhythm of removal, and a great part of it might be spent away from the valley altogether, in pleasures the poor could not so much as imagine. There was the season in town, the months when fashionable families went up to London, or to Bath and the other resorts, to the round of balls and assemblies, and routs and plays and card parties, the shopping and the visiting, the seeing and the being seen, the marriage market for the daughters and the politics and the clubs for the sons. The townhouse was opened and staffed, the carriages rolled up the long roads, and the family plunged into a brilliant social life among their own kind, the glittering world of fashion and rank and pleasure that turned upon the calendar of the season. And there were visits to other great houses, weeks spent as guests in the country mansions of friends and relations, the hospitality flowing back and forth across the land among the families who ruled it. The labourer, by contrast, was rooted to his valley as a tree is rooted to its ground. He was born in the parish, and very likely he would live and labour and die within a few miles of the cottage he was born in, tied to the place by his work and his poverty, and the very poor law itself, which bound a man to his own parish for relief and made wandering a risk. The wider world that the family moved through so freely, the town, the resort, the other counties, the nation, was to him a rumour, a thing heard of and never seen. The same months that carried the family up to London and its lights kept the labourer in the fields, doing the same work in the same place under the same sky, while the great house stood shuttered and quiet on its rise, its family far away among pleasures he would never know existed. And among those pleasures, in its season, was the resort, the spa town such as Bath, where fashionable society gathered to take the waters and to take its ease. There the family might pass weeks or months, lodging in fine rooms among their own kind, drinking the waters in the morning for their health, walking and being seen, attending the assemblies and the balls and the concerts and the plays, the card parties and the tea drinkings, the brilliant idle round of a watering place in its prime. It was a world made entirely of leisure and display and society, of seeing and being seen, of fashion and flirtation, and the careful business of marriage and standing carried on amid pleasure. A place where the rich went to enjoy their wealth among others enjoying theirs, far from the fields and the rents and the cottages that paid for all of it. The labourer in his valley would never see such a place, would scarcely believe in it if it were described to him, this town given over wholly to the amusement of the rich, where people went to drink water that was thought to do them good, and to dance the nights away in lit and crowded rooms. It belonged to another world entirely, though it was paid for, in the end, out of the same soil he ploughed. For out in those fields the afternoon was simply the morning continued, the same bent back, and the same aching hands, and the same unbroken labour going on through the long hours until at last the light began to fail. There was no idle stretch to be filled for the labourer, no pleasant choosing of how to pass the time, because for the poor time was not a possession but a master, and every hour of it was already claimed by the work that kept them alive. The labourer laboured on through the afternoon as he had through the morning. His wife, between her own unending tasks, kept half an eye on the smallest children and set the older ones to their jobs and bent again to her own. There was, for them, simply no such thing as an afternoon of leisure. There was only the long difference between a working day and a day of rest, and the days of rest were very few, for the poor lived by the turning of the year far more closely than the rich ever did, their lives shaped by the seasons of the land, and the work those seasons demanded, and the year had its own deep rhythm of labour and of rest. The days of true rest and merriment were scattered thin across it, but they were real, and they were seized upon with a whole heart when they came. The Sabbath chief of all, the one day in 7 when the heaviest work was set aside, and then the scattered feast days and holy days of the old calendar, the wakes and the village fairs, the May celebrations, the harvest home, the rough glad festival of Christmas with its few extra comforts. These were the bright threads woven through the hard cloth of the poor man's year, and the people took them when they came with a fierce and grateful gladness, a gladness, the rich, who were never once short of pleasure, and for whom every day was in some sense a holiday, could perhaps never quite feel in the same way. The harvest home above all was the high point of the year, a rare hour of plenty and rest, and rough joy for people who knew little enough of any of the three. But such days were the exceptions that proved the rule, the few bright points in a long year of toil, and this was not one of them, and so the work went on, and the sun sank slowly down the western sky, and the long shadows of the hedgerows stretched out across the fields toward the evening. And yet the poor man's year was not all unbroken toil, for it had its handful of high days that he lived toward and remembered, and chief among the homely ones was the killing of the pig. Late in the year, when the pig that had been fattened all through the months on scraps and gleanings was grown to its weight, came the day of its killing, a great event in the cottage economy, for it meant meat, the salting down of the bacon and the hams that would give the family a taste of flesh through the long winter, the making of the puddings and the using of every part. It was hard, and it was bloody, and it was also a kind of feast and a kind of triumph, the one time the cottage knew real plenty of its own, a little of the fresh meat eaten at once in a rare indulgence, some shared with the neighbours who would share their own pig-killing in turn. And there were the other bright days, the village wake that was the parish's own festival, the May Games, the rough merry rejoicing of Christmas with its extra food and its mumming and its few days' rest, the harvest home above all. These were the poor man's holidays, few and far between, and seized with a glad heart the bright threads in the dark cloth of the year, and he needed them, and earned them, and took his joy in them with a fullness the rich, who were never short of pleasure, could perhaps never quite know. And while the labour goes on in the fields, let me take you for a moment into the two gardens of the valley, the garden of the house and the garden of the cottage, for nowhere is the difference between the two lives written more plainly than in two patches of the same English earth. The garden of the house was a thing made purely for beauty and for pleasure, a designed and tended landscape that served no useful purpose but delight. Come out through the tall doors onto the terrace and look. There are lawns kept smooth as velvet by the scythe and the roller. There are gravelled walks winding between clipped hedges. There are flowers grown for nothing but their colour and their scent, beds of them blazing in the afternoon sun. There are ornamental trees and statues, and perhaps a glittering lake, with a little temple or a folly set artfully upon its bank to catch the eye. Beyond the garden the park rolls away, its turf cropped by the deer, its great trees standing singly or in clumps, just where a fashionable eye had decided they should stand, the broad sweep of it shaped and planted and improved at vast expense to look, in the end, like a perfected and idealized piece of nature. It was a luxury of pure ornament, this garden and this park, a landscape whose only crop was beauty, kept by a small army of gardeners for no reason at all, but that the family liked to look at it and to walk in it of an afternoon. The cottage had a garden too, but it was a garden of an utterly different kind, and every single foot of it was working for its keep. There were no lawns here, no flowers grown for show, no ornament of any kind. There was instead the close-packed plot of vegetables that helped to feed the family through the year, the rows of cabbages and beans and peas and onions, the bed of herbs for the pot and for medicine, the potatoes coming slowly into use. At the end of the plot was the sty with the pig in it, the single most valuable creature the family owned, fattened all through the year on scraps and leavings against the day in late autumn when it would be killed and salted down to give them meat through the winter. There were the hens scratching among the rows giving their few eggs. There was, perhaps, a fruit tree or two. The cottage garden was not a place of leisure, but a place of labour and of survival, tended in the scraps of time left over from all the other work, and what it grew was not beauty but life itself, the margin of food that could mean the difference, in a hard year, between getting through and going hungry. The one garden grew flowers, and the other grew cabbages. The one was walked in, and the other was worked, and in that single difference, the smooth ornamental lawn against the close-planted plot with its pig and its hens, the vast distance between the two worlds was held, as it were, in a handful of the same dark soil, and the land that the family walked in for pleasure they also held by a law that pressed hard upon the poor, for the same fields and woods and streams that gave the rich their sport, gave the poor a daily temptation and a daily danger. The game upon the estate, the deer in the park, the hares in the fields, the pheasants and the partridges in the coverts, the fish in the streams, all of it belonged by law to the landowner, and the taking of it by anyone else was a crime, watched for and pursued without mercy. To the gentleman it was sport, the shooting and the coursing and the hunting that filled his afternoons, a pleasure and a right that came with his acres. To the labourer, looking at a hare in a field his own hands had ploughed, or a pheasant fattening in the hedgerow, it was the maddening sight of good meat, meat his hungry children almost never tasted running free and forbidden across the land he worked. And so there was poaching, the taking of that forbidden game by the poor, by night, with snare and net and quiet skill, partly for the pot and partly to sell, an old and stubborn shadow economy of the countryside. And against the poacher the law was harsh and grew harsher, for the landowners who made the laws guarded their game jealously, and a man caught with a hare or a net could be fined beyond his means, imprisoned, or in time transported across the seas, his family left to the parish. The gamekeeper walked the coverts with his gun and his dogs, and there were spring guns and man-traps set in some woods to maim the trespasser, and bitter, sometimes bloody, struggles in the dark between keepers and poachers. Here was the law of the land laid bare. The same creature that was the gentleman's harmless afternoon's amusement was in the labourer's hands, a crime that could break his family, and the gulf between the two worlds was written into the statute book as plainly as it was written into the seating of the church. Let me speak too of the life of the mind, of music and books and learning, and the news of the age. For the rich lived among these things, and the poor lived almost wholly without them, and that was perhaps the quietest and deepest division of all. In the house there were books, shelves and rooms of them, and the family could read and did, the histories and the poetry and the novels and the sermons and the newspapers and the letters that carried the doings of the nation and the neighbourhood. There was music, taught by masters, played upon fine instruments, the daughters trained to it as an accomplishment. There were the prints and the pictures, the maps and the globes, the talk of politics and books, and the wider world that an educated family carried on among themselves and with their guests. The children were taught, the boys in their Latin and their figures, the girls in their reading and their music and their hands, and the life of the house was lit, however unevenly, by learning and by the printed word, and by knowledge of a realm far beyond the valley. Hello? The poor lived, for the most part, outside all of this. Few of them could read, for there was little schooling for the children of the poor, and less time to use it, and a labouring family might not own or have any use for a single printed page. Their knowledge of the wider world came not from newspapers, but by word of mouth, slow and partial, and shot through with rumour. But it would be wrong to think their minds empty, for they had a rich culture of their own that needed no books. The great store of songs and ballads and stories carried in the memory and handed down by voice, the proverbs and the riddles and the country lore, the deep practical knowledge of the land and the beasts and the weather and the work, knowledge as real and as hard-won as anything in the gentleman's library. It was a wisdom of the ear and the hand and the memory rather than of the printed page, and it was passed not in schoolrooms but at the fireside and in the field, from the old to the young, and it served them in their own sphere, as well as the gentleman's learning served him in his. And both worlds had their music and their dancing, though these too came in two such different forms. In the house music was an accomplishment and a polite pleasure, the daughters trained by masters to play the harpsichord and to sing, the fine instruments standing in the drawing-room, the airs and the songs of the day performed of an evening for the family and their guests, and the dancing was the formal, graceful dancing of the assembly, and the ball, the minuet and the country dances done in their figures, taught by the dancing master, performed in lit rooms in fine clothes as a part of the great social round. In the cottage and the village music was older and rougher, and came from the people themselves. The songs and the ballads sung at work, and by the fire, the fiddle or the pipe at the alehouse and the fair, and the dancing was the vigorous country dancing on the green and in the barn, at the wakes and the harvest home and the holidays, the community stamping and turning to the fiddle in their working clothes. The one music was learned and performed and refined, an ornament of leisure. The other was made and shared and handed down, woven into the work and the festivals of the people. And which of the two carried the more of human joy, the trained air in the candle-lit drawing-room, or the fiddle going at the harvest supper while the whole village danced, is again not so simple a question as it might seem. Now, this day we are following is an ordinary working day, but let me pause it a moment and carry you to the one day in the week that was different for everyone, the Sabbath, the Sunday, because the parish church on a Sunday morning was the single place in all the valley and all the week where the two worlds came together under one roof, and even there, even in the house of a God who was said to love them equally, the gulf between them was carefully and visibly kept. On a Sunday the whole valley came to church, summoned across the same fields by the same bell, the family from the house and the meanest labourer alike, all walking or riding to the grey old church among its yews. And once inside, they did not mingle. The family from the house sat at the very front, in their own grand box pew, a high-walled enclosure of polished wood with its own door and its own cushioned seats, sometimes with its own little fireplace to keep the great folk warm, raised and railed, and set apart from all the rest. Behind them sat their upper servants. Behind the servants sat the tenant farmers and the tradespeople in their Sunday best, and at the very back on the plain hard benches with no cushions and no fire sat the labouring poor in their patched and decent Sunday clothes. All of them heard the same words read out, and sang the same psalms, and were told in the sermon that before heaven they were equal souls, the rich man and the poor man alike, and that the meek and the lowly were blessed. And all of them could see, laid out before their eyes in the very seating of the church, from the cushioned box at the front to the bare bench at the back, exactly and unmistakably how unequal they were in the eyes of the world. The order of the valley was written into the order of the pews, and everyone could read it, and no one thought it strange, for it was simply how things were. And then the service ended, and the bell rang them out, and the family went home to their Sunday dinner, the finest of the week, and the poor went home to their bread and their pottage, and the 1 hour in which they had shared a roof and a faith was over for another 7 days, and the two worlds drew apart again into their separate lives. For the valley was not only the house and the cottage, but a small world of its own between and around them, and it is worth standing a moment in the village that lay along the lane below the church, for the village was where the wider life of the place went on. There was the cluster of cottages like the one we have looked into, and a few better houses, the farmhouses of the tenant farmers, more solid and more comfortable than the labourer's home, though far below the manor. There was the inn or the alehouse, the one place a working man might sit of an evening over a mug if he had a penny and the time, where the news was passed and the bargains struck and the rough talk and the rough songs went round. There was the smith at his forge and the wheelwright and the carpenter, and the miller at the mill by the stream who ground the valley's corn and took his share, and the few small tradespeople who served the place. There was the parson, in his parsonage, a man of education set among the unlettered, who christened and married and buried them all, and read them their duty on a Sunday, and whose own standing lay somewhere uneasily between the gentry he dined with and the poor he tended. And the parson's place in the valley says much about how religion itself sat between the two worlds. He was in most parishes a gentleman by education, and often by birth, holding his living from the patron of the parish, who was very often the master of the great house himself, so that the man who preached on a Sunday owed his place and his income in good part to the family in the front pew. He dined at the house, and moved among the gentry as one of them, and yet his duty lay among all his parishioners, the cottagers as well as the quality, to christen and marry and bury them, to visit the sick, to teach the children their catechism, to read them their duty and their comfort. Some did this faithfully and well, true shepherds to the poor of their flock. Others held the living for its income, and did the least that would serve, leaving the work to a poor curate, dining with the squire, and hunting with the gentleman, and forgetting the cottages. The church stood like everything else, woven into the order of degree, its livings in the gift of the great, its best places filled by gentlemen, and yet it carried also, however imperfectly, the one message that cut across all the degrees, that the souls in the box pew and the souls on the bare bench were equal before their Maker, a word of equality preached, week after week, in a building arranged from front to back to display the very opposite. And from that same church tower came the one voice that reached all the valley alike, the bells, which ordered and marked the shared life of the place as nothing else did. The bell rang out across the fields to call them all to church on a Sunday. The family and the labourer, hearing the same sound, carried on the same air. The bell told the hours and the Angelus where the old custom held, a thread of sound laid over the working day. It rang for the great occasions of the parish, pealing joyfully for a wedding, for a birth, for the news of a victory or a coronation, the glad sound rolling out over house and cottage together. And it tolled, slow and single and solemn, for a death, the passing bell counting out the years of a life just ended, and that mournful sound fell upon the great house and the small one alike, for death came to both, and the bell did not ask, as it tolled, whether the soul it tolled for had slept in a curtained bed or on a pallet by the fire. The bells belonged to no one and to everyone, the one possession of the valley that was truly shared, their sound falling free upon the just and the unjust, the rich and the poor, the family at their leisure and the labourer at his work, binding the scattered life of the place together for a few moments at a time under the open sky. A man in the field would straighten his back at the sound of them, and a lady at her window would pause, and for that moment, hearing the same bells, they were nearer to one another than in anything else in all their two divided lives. And then the sound died away over the fields, and the lady turned back to her ease, and the labourer to his furrow, and the valley went on as it had always gone on, two worlds beneath the one ringing sky, and over all of it, as its centre and its summit, stood the family at the house, the squire and his people, the great fact of local life. They were the largest landlord, the chief employer, the source of work and of charity and of trouble. They sat in the best pew and gave the Christmas doles and decided, in 100 ways, the fortunes of the place. To live in such a valley was to live in the shadow of the great house, to be its tenant or its servant or its labourer, to touch one's hat to its carriage, and to depend in the end upon its good will. The community was real, and there was kindness in it and neighbourliness, and the deep web of custom and kinship that bound poor folk together and helped them through. But it was a community with the manor always at its head, the life of the valley arranged, like the seats in the church, in a long descending order of degree from the family on the hill down to the poorest labourer in the last cottage on the lane. And the master of the house was not only the chief landlord of the valley, but very often its chief magistrate as well, for the gentleman who owned the land also, as a justice of the peace, administered the law upon it, and so the same man held in his hands the livelihoods and the liberties of the people below him. As a justice he heard the small cases of the neighbourhood, the petty thefts and the assaults and the disputes, the poaching, the women left with child, the labourers who broke their hire. He could fine, he could order a whipping, he could send a man to the house of correction, or commit him to await the assizes, where graver crimes met graver punishments, the prison, the transportation across the sea, the gallows itself. The law of that age was harsh, and it was harshest upon the poor, for it guarded above all things property, and a hungry man who stole was punished far more surely than a powerful man who oppressed. And the same gentleman, sitting as justice, also administered the poor law, deciding which of the parish poor should have relief and how much, ruling on which parish a pauper belonged to and might be sent back to, ordering the affairs of the workhouse. So the family at the house held the poor of the valley in their hands at every turn, as the landlord who could raise the rent or turn out the tenant, as the employer who could give work or withhold it, as the magistrate who could punish, and as the overseer of the relief that stood between the destitute and starvation. The poor man came before the rich man to be judged, and to be helped, and to be ruled, and the rich man's word carried the weight of the law and the land, and the settled order of things, while the poor man had little to set against it, but his hat in his hand, and his hope of mercy. And the master's power did not stop at the edge of his own estate, for a great landowner was a power in the county, and often in the nation too. He sat upon the bench with his fellow gentlemen, governing the affairs of the district. He might serve as sheriff, or as a deputy lieutenant, or send a member to Parliament, or sit there himself, for the governing of England was very largely in the hands of men like him, the landed gentry and the nobility who owned the soil and ruled those who worked it. His patronage reached out in every direction, the livings of the church in his gift, the small offices and favours and recommendations that could make or mar a man's fortune, the weight of his word in every local matter. To be a great landowner was to hold not only wealth, but power, social and legal and political, woven all through the country from the parish up to the Parliament, the nation governed by and for the men who owned its land. The labourer had none of it. No vote, no voice, no office, no patronage, no power over anything beyond the small compass of his own labour, and precious little over that. He was governed and judged and employed and relieved and never once consulted, one of the great voiceless mass upon whose labour the structure stood, and who had no hand at all in its ordering. The land gave the one man dominion over his fellows and gave the other only the work, and the gulf between the house and the cottage was in the end a gulf of power as much as of money. The difference between those who ruled and those who were ruled, under the same sky, in the same green country, 300 years ago. But the poor had their own gathering places and their own great days, and chief among them was the market and the fair, when the working people of the district came together, and the slow round of labour was broken by colour and noise and company. On market day, the nearest town filled with people, the farmers bringing in their beasts and their corn, the cottagers their few eggs and their butter, and their spun yarn to sell for the pennies that bought what they could not make, the stalls set out with cloth and pots and ribbons and all the small goods of life. There was bargaining and gossip, and the meeting of friends and kin from other villages, the news passed, the matches made, a mug taken at the inn, and the fair, which came once or twice in the year, was greater still, a high holiday of the poor man's calendar, the hiring fairs where servants and labourers stood to be taken on for the year, and the pleasure fairs with their stalls and their shows, the gingerbread and the ribbons, the wrestling and the dancing, the cheap jacks and the players and the wonders, a rare blaze of colour and indulgence and freedom in lives that knew little of any of the three. To the rich, the local fair was a quaint and rather low diversion, to be looked in upon perhaps with amused condescension and left behind. Their own great gatherings were the assemblies and the races and the season in town, in finer company and at far greater cost. But to the poor the fair was a true festival, longed for and remembered, one of the few days when a labouring family might spend a hard-saved penny on pure pleasure, when the children might taste a sweet and stare at a show, when the young might court and the old might meet. For the young of the cottages had their courting like the young everywhere, at the fair and the harvest and the dance on the green, the walking out together in the long summer evenings after the work was done, the shy beginnings that led to the banns and the wedding and a new cottage and the round beginning over, and the children, even the children set so early to work, found their play in the scraps of time between the games in the lane and the field, the simple home-made toys, the running and the laughing that no poverty could quite put out, for children will be children in any age and any cottage. And there was laughter in those poor homes as well as labour. When for a day the grinding round was set aside, and there was music and laughter, and the bright crowded gladness of a people making the most of one of their few bright days. And then the fair was over, and the goods were packed away, and the people walked the long miles home along the darkening lanes to the cottages and the work, carrying the memory of it to warm them through the labour until it should come again. Let me speak too of the body itself, of sickness and health and the keeping of the person, for here again the same valley held two different fates. Begin with the simple matter of being clean, which we think so plain a thing, and which was in that age a quiet measure of wealth. The rich did not bathe as we do, but cleanliness for them lay in linen, in the daily change of a fresh white shift or shirt, and of this they had plenty, drawers and presses full of it, washed and bleached and ironed by the laundry maids, so that a person of fashion went always in clean linen, and smelled of nothing worse than powder and a little scent. There was heated water brought when it was wanted, and soap, and soft towels, and time, and privacy, and servants to fetch and carry it all. In the cottage there was the cold water of the well, carried in by hand, and one shift or shirt worn until it could be spared for the great labour of washing, and hard soap or none, and no privacy and little time. The poor kept as clean as weariness and want allowed, which was not always very clean, not because they did not care, but because cleanliness itself, the water and the fuel to heat it, and the linen to change into, and the leisure to do it in, was a thing that cost money the poor did not have. Even being clean, that seemed so simple, was in the end a matter of wealth. And the body itself in that age was harder to keep sweet and clean than we can easily imagine. And here too the rich had every advantage. Vermin were the common lot of the time, the fleas and the lice and the bugs that infested bedding and clothing and hair, and even the great house was not free of them, for all its changing of linen and its airing of rooms. But the rich had the means to fight them, the fresh linen daily, the washing and the combing, the servants to clean and to air and to launder, the powder and the scent to mask what could not be helped. The poor had far less defence, the few garments worn long between washings, the crowded bed shared by the family, the close warm cottage that harboured what it gathered, the want of spare linen and hot water and time. Keeping the body clean and free of vermin was, like everything else, a labour that cost water and fuel and soap and time, and the poor had too little of all of them, so that the cottager bore more of the small miseries of the unwashed body than the gentleman did, not from any want of caring, but from the plain want of means. The gentleman went in clean linen and smelled of powder. The labourer went in the same shirt for a week of sweating work, and could do little about it. And even in this most intimate and bodily matter, the comfort of being clean in one's own skin, the wealth of the one and the poverty of the other, followed them, as it followed them everywhere, down to the very surface of the body itself. And when sickness came, as it came to every house, it came very differently to the two. When the rich fell ill, the physician was sent for, riding out from the town in his own carriage to attend them at their bedside, and though the medicine of that age could in truth do far less than it believed, with its bleedings and its purgings and its guesses, there was at least the warm room, the clean bed, the good and tempting food, the careful nursing by servants, the rest that a body needs to mend, and the means to command all of it for as long as it was wanted. When the poor fell ill, there was rarely a physician at all, for his fee was a thing far beyond their reach. There was the wise woman of the village with her herbs and her old remedies, some of them shrewd and some of them useless, and there was the hard, cruel necessity of working on while sick, because a day not worked was a day not paid and a day not fed. Childbirth, which came often to the women of both houses, was a danger to all, but a sharper danger to the poor woman who rose from it too soon and went back too quickly to her labour, and who bore child after child with too little between and too little to feed them on. A serious illness in the cottage was not one misfortune, but the threat of many. For if the labourer could not labour, the wages stopped, and behind every sickness of the poor, always, stood the cold shadow of want. When the family of the house wanted medicine, the apothecary made it up to the physician's order, the draughts and the powders and the pills, delivered and paid for without a thought to the cost. When the poor were ill, the apothecary, who was the poor man's doctor where there was one at all, might be appealed to for a cheap remedy, but more often the cottage fell back upon its own resources, the wise woman's herbs, the old remedies handed down, the simples gathered from the hedgerow and the garden, the charms and the prayers. Much of it could do little against a real sickness, and the medicine of the rich, for all its cost, could often do little more. But the poor man bore his illness without the warm room and the good food and the rest, and the nursing that gave the rich body its best chance to mend, and he bore it, very often, while still dragging himself to whatever work he could do, because to lie by was to lose the wage, and to lose the wage was to bring hunger on the house. The rich could afford to be ill, to take to their beds and be tended until they were well. The poor could not afford it, and so they sickened harder and died sooner, not always for want of the physician, but for want of all the comfort and the rest and the plenty that the physician's patients had as a matter of course. And then, over all of it, comes the season that divided the two worlds most sharply of any, the winter, the long, dark, cold heart of the English year, which the rich passed in comfort and the poor merely tried to survive. Up at the house, the coming of winter changed the life within it surprisingly little. The fires were built higher and lit in more of the rooms, the curtains drawn earlier against the early dark, the warmer clothes brought out, but there was fuel in the cellars and the wood yard in plenty, and food laid by in the stores, and the salted meat, and the preserves, and the root vegetables, and the wine, and snug beds with warming pans passed between the sheets, and warm clothing of wool and fur. The winter, for the family, was a thing to be looked at through the window, the snow lying clean and beautiful and harmless across the park, the bare trees etched against the grey sky, a season of cosy evenings by the fire and the pleasures of Christmas. It was, if anything, rather pretty. In the cottage, winter was the enemy, the season the poor feared and braced against, and were lucky to come through unharmed. The cold came in everywhere, through the thin clay walls, and the unglazed window, and under the ill-fitting door, and the small fire could not hold it back. The fuel that had to be gathered and hoarded ran always too short, and to let the fire die in the deep of winter was not a discomfort, but a real danger to life. The food from the garden was long gone, the stores were thin, and the price of bread rose just when the work in the frozen fields grew scarce, so that the coldest and hungriest months were also the months of least wages, a cruel doubling of want. And it was in winter, above all, that the poor died, the old and the very young, and the already weak carried off by the cold and the hunger, and the fevers and the coughs that preyed upon bodies with too little between them and the weather. A hard winter could empty a place by a corner of the cottage. Take a grandparent, take a child. The very same frost that turned the park of the great house into a sparkling picture of beauty turned the cottage into a place of genuine and present peril, and the two households, that quarter of a mile apart, met the turning of the year as though they lived not in one climate but in two, the one wrapped warm and watching the snow for its beauty, the other huddled close about a failing fire and counting the sticks and praying for the spring. And the weather, which the house could shut out and the cottage could not, fell upon the two worlds with the same difference as everything else. Let a storm come up over the valley, the sky darkening, the wind rising, the rain driving down in sheets. In the house, they drew the curtains and built up the fire and watched the storm through the streaming glass as a kind of spectacle, snug and dry, the wind in the chimneys only making the comfort within the sweeter. In the cottage, the storm was an enemy at the door, the rain driving in under the thatch and around the shutter, the wind finding every crack in the clay walls, the fire guttering, the damp creeping into everything, the labourer perhaps still out in it, because the work could not stop for weather, trudging the long wet miles home soaked to the skin. The same storm that was a cosy spectacle from the drawing-room window was a misery and sometimes a danger in the cottage, and when it had passed, the house dried itself at its fires while the cottage stayed damp for days, and the labourers' wet clothes were pulled on wet again the next morning. And now the light begins to go, the long afternoon wearing down toward dusk, the sun dropping behind the western trees and the shadows flooding up out of the valley. With the coming of the evening, we reach the matter that, more than almost any other in the long day, divided the bright rooms of the rich from the cold, dim dwelling of the poor, the matter of light itself, and of fire, and of how a household met the falling of the dark. For you must understand that light after sunset was not, in that age, a free or an easy thing. It did not come at the touch of a hand. It had to be made, and made from materials that cost money, and so the amount of light a household could command after dark was a direct and visible measure of its wealth, and the difference between the two houses, as the night came on, was the difference between brightness and shadow. In the house upon the rise, as the dusk gathers, the servants go quietly round from room to room, and the candles are lit, many of them, dozens of them, good candles of beeswax that burn with a clear, bright, sweet-smelling flame, or of the finer sort of tallow, set into the silver candlesticks, and the branching candelabra, and the sconces upon the walls. And as each is lit, the rooms bloom into gold, the light caught and thrown back and doubled by the looking-glasses, and the polished silver and the tall dark windows, so that the drawing-room and the dining-room glow warm and brilliant against the black night pressing at the glass. There was a hierarchy even in the making of light. The beeswax candles, costly and clean and sweet-burning, that the rich could use without stint in their finest chambers, the cheaper tallow candles of rendered fat that smoked a little and smelled of the kitchen, kept for the lesser chambers and the servants, and far below them the poor man's rushlight and his bare fire, and the family that filled its drawing-room with a blaze of good wax of an evening, and let the candles gutter and be replaced without a thought, spent on a single bright evening's light more than a cottage might burn in candles and rushes in a year of careful darkness. The fires are built up high in every chamber that is in use, coal and seasoned wood burning freely and without stint, for the house has fuel laid in by the cartload and need never count a single log, warmth and brightness, that the two comforts of a body against the dark and the cold of an English night are simply there, in abundance, wherever the family happen to be, summoned at will and never reckoned, and the long evening unfolds within that golden glow as though the night outside had no power to touch it. And what an evening it was! For the hours after the dark came down were for the rich among the pleasantest of the day. There was supper, a lighter meal than the dinner, but elegant still, taken late. There was music, the candles lit upon the harpsichord, a daughter playing, voices joining in the songs of the day. There were the card tables set out, and the games that could run long into the night with their small stakes and their large pleasures. There was reading aloud, one of the company reading to the others as they sat with their work or their wine. There was talk, endless easy talk, by the fire. And on the grander evenings there was company come from the neighbouring houses, or the family gone out to such company, dressed in their finest by candlelight, the carriage called to the door. And in the towns and the spa places there were the assemblies and the balls, the great lit rooms, the music and the dancing late into the night, The brilliant social life of the leisured world carried on by the light of 1,000 candles, while the country lay dark around it. The evening, for the rich, was not an ending of the day, but in many ways its flowering, a long golden span of pleasure that they were in no hurry at all to bring to a close. And on the great evenings, when the house entertained, that pleasure rose to its height, and the establishment turned itself toward the giving of hospitality, which was among the chief glories and chief duties of a family of standing. Then the best rooms were thrown open and lit with every candle, and the guests arrived by carriage through the dark, handed down at the lit door, and shown up by the footman into the blaze of the drawing-room. There was a dinner of even more courses and more splendour than the daily one, the finest the cook could achieve, the best plate set out, the best wine brought up from the cellar, the table a long glittering landscape of silver and glass and candlelight. There was conversation, the talk of the county and the nation, the news and the wit and the gossip. There was music after, and cards, and perhaps dancing, if the company was large and young enough, the figures moving down the candle-lit room to the sound of the instruments. It was a performance, in its way, this hospitality, a display of the family's wealth and taste, and standing before their equals, and it was also a real pleasure, the glowing sociable heart of a leisured life, the coming together of the ruling families of the district in ease and abundance and good company. And it went on late, far into the night, the candles burning down and being replaced, the servants waiting in the shadows ready at every moment, tired on their feet, but unable to seek their beds until the family and the guests sought theirs. And when at last the guests were gone, or shown to their chambers, and the family went up, the footman and the maids fell upon the wreckage of the evening, the guttered candles, and the dirtied plate, and the disordered rooms, and laboured on in the small hours to set all to rights before they might at last climb to their own cold beds, so that even the family's brightest pleasures rested, like everything else in the house, upon the unsleeping labour of the hands below. And in the cottage, that same darkness came down across the same fields. There was almost no light at all. A poor family could not afford to burn good candles, and very often could not afford candles of any kind, for even the cheap rushlight had its small cost. The rushlight was the poor man's candle, a length of dried rush, peeled and dipped in whatever fat could be spared from the cooking, that gave a thin, wavering flame, dim and smoky, and quickly burned away enough to see by for a little while, and barely that. But more often than not the only light in the cottage of an evening was the light of the fire itself, the family drawn in close about the hearth in the deepening gloom, the firelight flickering red and gold across their faces, while the corners of the one room sank away into shadow. And the fire too had to be watched and counted, for fuel was no freer than candles. The poor burned what little they had gathered, carefully, sparingly, because a cold hearth on a winter's night was a danger, and not merely a discomfort, and what was burned tonight could not be burned tomorrow. So the poor family's evening was short, and dim, and close, drawn in tight about the little warmth and the little light they had, and there was a plain and sensible reason why the poor went so early to their beds, not idleness, but economy, for to be asleep was to need neither candle nor, under the shared and piled coverings, quite so much fire. They lay down soon after the dark came fully down, all of them together in the 1 or 2 beds, the children tucked between their parents for the warmth of the bodies, and the cottage went dark and silent while up the hill the candles still burned bright in their dozens, and the music played, and the evening was nowhere near its end. Before the bed there was the last of the food, the supper that was scarcely a meal at all, the remains of the pottage, a piece of bread, what the day had left eaten quickly in the firelight, and then the fire was banked, and the few were settled, and the long Georgian night closed over the cottage hours before it would close over the house, And yet that dim and crowded hour by the fire had a warmth in it of its own that the bright drawing-room could not always claim, for it was here, in the firelight, that the real life of the poor family gathered itself in for the night. The rich had their books and their music and their cards and their company to fill the dark hours. The poor, who could not read, had something older and in its way deeper, the spoken word handed down by heart. Here in the firelight the old tales were told, the stories of ghosts and of the cunning folk, and of things that walked the lanes at night. The songs and the ballads passed down from grandmother to grandchild without ever once being written, the riddles and the sayings and the rough country wisdom. Here the talk of the day's doings went round, who had been seen and what had been said, the small news of the village. Here the wife's hands kept moving, even now, mending by touch as much as by the dim light, or knitting, or spinning on a little longer. Here the children leaned sleepy against their mother before they were carried to the bed. It was a life lived not in print, but in voice and in memory, and in the warm press of bodies in a small space, and it bound the family close in the little circle of the firelight, while the great dark pressed in all around, a closeness born of having nothing in the world but one another and one warm corner to share. And it was, in its own way, not the poorest thing in that poor room, and it was in such fire-lit hours, among such people, that the older beliefs of the countryside lived on most strongly, the web of faith and fear and custom that ran far deeper and far older than the religion preached from the pulpit on a Sunday. For the poor of the valley were Christian, and went to church and held to its great comforts, but woven all through their lives was another older thing, a world of signs and charms and unseen powers, of luck to be courted and ill luck to be turned aside. There were the cunning folk, the wise men and wise women, who for a small fee would cure a sick beast or a sick child with herbs and words, find what was lost, tell a fortune, lift a curse or lay one, sell a charm against the evil eye. There were the countless small observances of daily life, the things one did and did not do, the saluting of the magpie, the horseshoe over the door, the care taken at births and deaths and the turning points of the year, the half-believed dread of the fairy and the ghost and the witch. The rich, with their education and their fashionable reason, looked down on all of this as the ignorant superstition of the vulgar, and laughed at it or deplored it, and yet it answered, for the poor, to a real need that the cold comfort of reason could not always meet. For people who lived so close to the edge, whose harvest or whose child or whose single cow might be saved or lost by causes they could not see or control, the charm and the cunning man and the observance gave a handhold, a way of acting upon a frightening and uncertain world, a thread of hope and of meaning. It was a faith of the powerless, and it lived in the same firelit rooms as the old stories, passed down the same way, and it bound the people to their place and their dead and their seasons, with ties far older than the church upon the hill, the deep and ancient underlife of the poor, invisible from the windows of the house. And if the poor had little, that they had one another, and the bonds among them were a real wealth of a kind, the account books never showed, for a community of the poor survived by helping itself in 1,000 small unrecorded ways. When a woman was brought to bed, the neighbour women came to help. When a man was sick or hurt and could not work, his neighbours might get in his harvest or share what little they had, knowing their own turn might come. The old were minded, the orphan taken in, the dying watched, that they're laid out and carried to the grave by the hands of those who had known them. There was the lending and the borrowing of the small necessaries, the sharing of an oven or a tool or a skill, the gathering at the births and the marriages and the burials that marked the passage of their lives. It was not sentimental, this neighbourliness, for the poor could be hard on one another too, and quick to judge, and there was little enough to go round. But it was real, and it was necessary, and it was woven deep into the life of the cottages. For the poor knew, as the rich did not need to know, that they stood or fell together, that against the cold and the hunger and the cruelty of chance, they had no defence but their own strength and each other, no steward, no servants, no physician, no cushion of money, nothing but the web of kin and neighbour that held them. And so they built that web strong, out of custom and necessity, and a rough deep loyalty, and it carried them through the troubles that would have sunk a solitary soul, the shared poverty made just bearable by being shared. The family in the house had their wealth and their comfort and their wide acquaintance among their own kind. The family in the cottage had their poverty and their labour and the close fierce community of the poor, and which of the two, in the end, knew the warmer human bond was perhaps not so simple a question as the distance between their two dwellings might suggest. And the people of the cottage, in their turn, must not be flattened into mere figures of patient suffering, for they were as fully human as the family on the hill, with their own characters and their own pleasures and their own fierce dignity, and they did not think of themselves as objects of pity. The labourer had his pride, the deep satisfaction of a skill mastered, and a job well done, the straight furrow, the well-built rick, the hedge laid true, the craft of the land that he knew better than any gentleman ever could. He had his pleasures, rough and real, the mug at the alehouse, the song, the sport of the fair, the courting and the marrying, the watching of his children grow. His wife had her own pride in a clean cottage and a well-kept garden, and a family held together against the odds, her own friendships, and her own standing among the women of the place, her own deep knowledge and competence in the 100 arts of making do. They laughed and loved and quarrelled and hoped and took their joys where they found them. They were not noble savages nor patient martyrs, but ordinary people living the only life they knew, and finding in it, as people do, enough of warmth and meaning, and even happiness to make it worth the living. They did not, for the most part, spend their days in bitter envy of the house on the hill, for the great chain of degree seemed to them as fixed as the weather, and a man does not waste his strength raging at the rain. They lived their own lives, within their own world by their own lights, and that world, for all its hardship, was whole and human and their own. To see only their poverty and not their dignity and their pleasures and their full humanity would be to see them as the gentry too often saw them, as a lesser order rather than as people, and they were people every bit as much as the lord and the lady, living their one life under the same sky, and worthy tonight of being seen so. And they had their treasures too, small and few and precious, that meant more to them than all the silver of the house meant to its owners. The Sunday clothes kept carefully folded in the chest and worn only to church and to the great days, the one good gown, the one good coat, brushed and mended and made to last a lifetime. A few bits of pewter or china kept upon the shelf for show and pride rather than use. A treasured ribbon, a keepsake, a Bible if anyone could read it, passed down with the family's name written inside. The pig in the sty, the most valuable thing they owned, watched and tended with real affection as well as need. A handful of flowers grown at the cottage door for no reason but to look at, the one small extravagance of beauty the poor allowed themselves amid all the working ground. These were the riches of the cottage, and they were dear to it out of all proportion to their worth, loved and kept and shown with a pride as real as any gentleman's pride in his pictures and his plate, for the poor took their pleasures and their treasures where they could find them, and a single ribbon or a row of flowers at the door could carry as much of a heart's gladness as all the glittering abundance up at the house carried for the family that scarcely paused to see it. Before we let both houses sink into the night, let me follow this contrast to the far end of a life. For the difference between the two worlds did not end with the day's work, but ran on to the very last of a person's years. The rich grew old as they had lived, in comfort and in safety. An old gentleman or an old lady of the house kept their place at the head of the table, and by the best of the fire, served and tended and warmed to the end, their wants met by others as they had always been met, dying at last in the same curtained beds in which they had slept their entire lives, with the physician in attendance and the family gathered, and the long ease of their days carried unbroken into their final hours. Old age for them brought its aches and its sorrows as it does to all, but it brought no want and no fear of want, no falling off in the warmth and the food and the care. They were provided for, as they had always been provided for, simply because of who they were. The poor had no such gentle ending waiting for them, and the knowledge of it sat behind all their labouring days like a shadow on the wall. For the labourer's living lay in his strength, and when at last that strength failed, when he grew too old or too broken or too sick to do the work, the wages stopped, and there was nothing of his own to fall back upon, for there had never been anything to spare to lay by. An old labourer fell back, if he was fortunate, upon his grown children to be taken into a cottage already too small, and fed from a pot already too thin, an extra mouth among people who loved him, but could barely feed themselves. And if there were no children able to keep him, he fell back upon the parish, upon the grudging relief that the old poor law allowed to those who could no longer support themselves, a few pennies a week doled out by the overseers, or a place in the poorhouse, where the aged and the orphaned and the sick and the destitute of the parish were gathered together to be kept as cheaply as might be. To have laboured hard through a long life, to have fed the valley with the work of one's hands, and to come at the end of it to dependence and charity and the cold corner of the poorhouse, was the common fate of the labouring poor, and it was one more weight, perhaps the heaviest of all, that the family up at the house, looking out over the very fields that old man had ploughed, would never once in their lives be asked to carry. And so a life ran its course in that valley, from the cradle to the grave, and even the great turning points that come to every life, the being born, the marrying, the dying, came differently to the two houses. A birth in the manor was attended by the physician or the man midwife as the fashion grew, the mother lying in for weeks in a warm, clean room, nursed and tended, the child given to a wet nurse and then to the nursery, christened with ceremony, its arrival a matter of settlements and inheritance, and the carrying on of the family and its name. The birth in the cottage was attended by the village midwife, the experienced neighbour woman, the mother up and back at her work far too soon because the work could not wait, the child one more mouth to feed in a house already stretched, welcomed with love and with worry in equal measure, and carried to the church to be christened in its turn. A marriage among the rich was half a matter of the heart and half a matter of property, of settlements and dowries and the joining of estates made with an eye to fortune and family and the keeping up of the line. A marriage among the poor was a simpler thing, two young people of the same hard world setting up together with almost nothing, the banns read in the church, the plain ceremony, and then the same labouring life shared now 2 by 2, the cottage and the children, and the unending work. And death came to both, as it comes to all, but it came earlier and oftener to the poor, who buried more of their children and wore out sooner with the labour and the want, and even in death the order held, for the rich were laid in the church itself, or in fine tombs in the churchyard, with carved stones to keep their names, while the poor were laid in the plain earth of the same churchyard, in graves soon grass-grown and unmarked, their names kept only in the memory of those who had loved them, and lost in a generation or two, even from there. The one bell tolled for both of them across the same fields, but it told them, as it had lived them, into 2 different kinds of rest. And when death did come, But the mourning of it differed as the living had. In the house there was the formal grief of a family of standing, the blinds drawn, the household put into black, the mourning clothes ordered, the funeral conducted with proper solemnity and expense, the coffin fine, the service full, the family vault or the carved stone in the church to keep the name and the dignity of the dead. There was real grief in it, for grief is no respecter of rank, but it was grief that could afford to be expressed in form and ceremony, supported by all the means and customs of wealth. In the cottage the grief was as deep, and the means were nothing. The dead were laid out by the neighbour women, watched through the night, carried to the churchyard by the hands of friends, buried as cheaply as decency allowed, for even a pauper's funeral was a dread and a disgrace. The poor strained every nerve to avoid scraping and borrowing to give their dead a decent burial, rather than have the parish do it. And then they went back, the very next day, to the work that could not wait, carrying their loss with them into the field and the cottage, with no leisure to mourn, and no means to mark the grave. The love no less, and the parting no easier, only the time and the money to grieve in that the poor, here as everywhere, simply did not have. But now the night has come fully down over the valley, and it is time to let both houses go to their rest. And here, in the simple manner of their sleeping, the long contrast of the day gathers itself at last into a single quiet picture. Come up with me one final time to the house. Late now, the guests gone home or gone up to their chambers, the card tables abandoned, the last candles guttering low, the great fires sunk to a deep red glow. The master and the mistress are lit up the staircase by a servant carrying a branch of candles into the warm bedchamber where the fire still burns, and where, a little while before, a maid passed a warming pan of hot coals slowly between the sheets, so that the bed should be warm to lie down in. They sink into the clean linen and the piled blankets, safe and snug and easy, the curtains drawn close around them against the night, the house quiet and locked and guarded by its servants all around them, and tomorrow promising nothing more troublesome than another day as comfortable and as full of ease as this one has been. And down across the black fields the cottage holds its sleeping family in the one close room, the fire sunk now to a few last embers that will be carefully banked to keep alive till morning, the air gone cold, the wooden shutter closed against the dark. The labourer and his wife and their children lie close together in the 1 or 2 beds under every covering they own, the small ones in the warm middle, all of them tired to the very bone, taking the few short hours of rest the night allows before the cold dark of another morning calls the wife to the embers and the man to the fields once again. The same night lies over both the houses, the great one on its rise and the small one in the fields. The same stars wheel slowly overhead, the same owl calls across the same dark valley, and in sleep perhaps, the distance between them is at its very smallest, for sleep is the one good thing the poor have in as full a measure as the rich, and the one warm bed the labourers' children know is the press of their own family close around them in the dark. And both houses at the end of it knew the same plain animal good of rest, though they came to it by such different roads. The family lay down tired, perhaps, with the pleasant weariness of a day of riding or visiting or dancing, the agreeable tiredness of a body that has been pleased rather than spent. The labourer and his wife lay down with the deep bone weariness of bodies worked hard to their limit, the back that ached, the hands that throbbed, the feet that had stood and walked the long day, the tiredness that is not pleasant but necessary, the body simply used up and crying out for the few hours of dark in which to mend itself before it must rise and be spent again. And yet sleep, when it came, was sleep for both, the one good thing given freely and equally to the rich and the poor alike, the great leveller that asked no rank and took no rent, in which the lord and the labourer alike let go of the day, and sank down into the same forgetting, under the same stars, for the few short hours before the morning called them back to their two such different lives. I have shown you these 2 days, the golden one and the hard one, set side by side as they were truly lived, because the house upon the hill is so very beautiful, and it is, that we can too easily forget it was only ever one half of the picture. Every warm and candle-lit hour up at the house was bought, in the end, by the cold and labouring hours down in the fields. The two were bound together, the one resting its whole weight upon the other, under the single Georgian sky. The lord in his library and the labourer in his furrow were not two separate worlds, but one world, the same valley, the same day, the near side and the far side of one unequal life. And the men and the women of that cottage were as real as the family in the house, real people who woke and worked and loved and grieved and endured, who raised their children and buried some of them, and kept their small fires burning against the dark, and who bore their hard portion with a dignity and an endurance that the histories, busy with the great and the grand, too rarely pause upon. It felt right tonight to stand a while in the low doorway of the cottage as well as in the bright hall of the house, and to let you see all of the valley, both of its dwellings, and not only the fine one upon the hill. If you would like to wander into another vanished day with me on another night, you are always welcome to subscribe, and there is no cost and no hurry in any of it. The door will simply be open, and another of these quiet journeys will be waiting whenever you wish to return. It has been a true pleasure to spend the few hours of this one in your company, in that far green valley, watching the long light come and go over both its houses. But now the last candle is out, up at the house, and the last embers are greying in the cottage hearth, and the valley has gone down together into the dark and the deep quiet of the night, and there is nothing left for you to do, nothing at all, but let it all soften and loosen and drift away from you. The bright rooms and the one small room, the laden table and the single pot, the warming pan and the banked fire, the lord and the labourer alike, all of it sinking gently down into the dark as the sleep comes up at last to meet you. Let the long day rest now. Let both the houses rest. The valley will hold them safe until the morning. Sleep well. Stay warm. Be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.